Part 1, Chapters 1 and 2 of the Mysteries of Marseilles. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recorded by Celine Major. The Mysteries of Marseille by Émile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Part 1, Chapter 1. How Blanche De Cazalis eloped with Philippe Cayol. Towards the end of the month of May, 1804 , a man about 30 years of age was walking rapidly along a footpath in the St. Joseph quarter, near the Aiguillade. He had left his horse in the care of a small cultivator occupying a neighboring farm, and was going in the direction of a large, solidly built square house, a kind of country chateau, such as are to be found on the hills of Provence. The man turned aside to avoid the chateau and went and seated himself in a pine wood, which spread out behind the building. Then, anxious and feverish, he pushed aside the branches and glanced along the pathways, apparently awaiting someone with impatience. Now and again he rose and took a few steps, then reseated himself all in a tremble. This man, who was tall and of strange appearance, wore bushy black whiskers. His long face, marked by energetic lineaments, displayed a kind of violent and passionate beauty. Suddenly his eyes softened, and a tender smile spread over his thick lips. A young girl had just issued from the chateau, and, stooping as though to hide herself, was hastening towards the pine wood. Rosy and breathless, she reached the shelter of the trees. She was barely 16 years old. Beneath the blue ribbons of her straw hat, her young face was smiling with a joyous and at the same time a startled expression. Her fair hair fell over her shoulders. Her little hands, pressed to her breast, were endeavoring to calm her throbbing heart. "How late you are, Blanche," said the young man. "I had almost given up hoping to see you." And he seated her on the moss beside him. "Forgive me, Philippe," answered the young girl. "My uncle has gone to Aix to purchase an estate, but I could not get rid of my governess." She yielded herself to the embrace of him she adored, and the two lovers enjoyed one of those long talks which are at once so silly and so sweet. Blanche was like a big child playing with her lover as she would have done with a doll. Philippe, now ardent and speechless, was pressing the young girl to him and gazing upon her with all the transports of love and ambition. And whilst they were seated there, oblivious of the world, they noticed, on raising their heads, some peasants who were following a neighboring path, whilst watching them and laughing. Blanche, full of alarm, drew away from her lover. "I am lost!" she exclaimed, turning quite pale. "Those men will inform my uncle. Ah, for pity's sake, Philippe, save me!" The young man jumped up on hearing her cry. "If you wish me to save you," he replied impetuously, "you must follow me. Come, let us fly together. Tomorrow your uncle will consent to our marriage, and we shall be united for evermore." "Fly, fly," repeated the child. "Ah, I fear I have not the courage to do so. I am too weak, too timid." "I will sustain you, Blanche. We will live a life of love." Blanche, without hearing, without replying, let her head drop on Philippe's shoulder. "Oh, I dread the convent," she resumed after a time in a low voice. "You will marry me, you will love me always." "I love you. See, I am on my knees." Then, closing her eyes, yielding, Blanche hastily descended the slope, clinging to the arm of Philippe, who had risen. After she had gone some distance, she looked back a last time at the home she was leaving, and a poignant emotion filled her eyes with tears. A minute's error had sufficed to throw her into the young man's arms, exhausted and confiding. She loved Philippe with all the warmth of a first passion, with all the folly of her inexperience. She was running away like a schoolgirl, voluntarily, and without weighing the terrible consequences of her flight. And Philippe was carrying her off, intoxicated with his victory, and quivering at feeling her moving and panting at his side. At first he thought of hastening to Marseilles to procure a vehicle. But he was afraid to leave her alone on the high road, and he preferred to go with her on foot as far as his mother's country house, which was situated quite a league away in the Saint-Just quarter. Philippe had to leave his horse behind, and the two lovers started off bravely together. They passed through meadows, ploughed fields, and pine woods, taking short cuts and walking very quickly. It was about 4:00. The sun, clear and scorching, cast before them broad sheets of light. and they hastened along in the warm air, urged on by the madness which was eating into their hearts. As they passed by, the labourers raised their heads and watched their flight with amazement. It did not take them an hour to reach the home of Philippe's mother. Blanche, quite tired out, seated herself on a stone bench beside the door, whilst the young man went to see if the coast was clear. He then returned and conducted her to his room. He had begged Ayas, a gardener whom his mother was employing that day, to fetch a vehicle from Marseille. Both were still a prey to the excitement of their flight. Whilst awaiting the vehicle, they remained silent and anxious. Philippe, having led Blanche to a little chair, knelt at her feet, and gazed lingeringly at her, seeking to reassure her by gently kissing the hand she yielded to him. " You cannot remain in that light gown," he said after a time. " Would you like to dress up as a man?" Blanche smiled. She felt childlike joy at the thought of disguising herself. " My brother is rather short," continued Philippe. " You can put on some of his things." It made them quite merry. The young girl dressed herself, laughing the while. She was charmingly awkward, and Philippe eagerly kissed the blushes on her cheeks. When she was ready, she had quite the appearance of a little man, of a youngster of 12. She had great difficulty in confining her mass of hair in the hat, and her lover's hands trembled as he gathered the rebellious locks together. Ayas at length returned with the vehicle. He consented to receive the fugitives in his own home at St. Barnabé. Philippe took what money he possessed, and all three entered the carriage, which they left at the Pont du Jarret, continuing the journey to the gardener's house on foot. It was now twilight. Transparent shadows were falling from the pale heavens, whilst acrid odours rose from the earth, still warm with the last rays of the sun. Then a vague fear took possession of Blanche. Her heart was sinking within her. She sought to gain time. " Listen," said she to Philippe. " I will write to my confessor, Abbe Chastanier. He will go and see my uncle to obtain my pardon and his consent to our marriage. I think I should not be so frightened were I your wife." Philippe smiled at the tender simplicity of the last words. " Write to Abbe Chastanier," he answered. " For my part, I will send my brother our address. He will come to-morrow and will take your letter." It was thus that Blanche de Cazalis eloped with Philippe Cayol, one fine May evening. Ah, sweet and terrible night, which was doomed to overwhelm the lovers with wretchedness, and bring them nothing but suffering and regret for the rest of their lives. Chapter II introduces the hero, Marius Cayol. Marius Cayol, the brother of Blanche's lover, was about 25 years old. He was short, thin, and puny. His light yellow face, with its long, narrow, black eyes, was lighted up at times with a kind of smile of self-devotion and resignation. He walked with a slight stoop, and the hesitation and timidity of a child. But the hatred of evil, the love of uprightness that filled his being, made him appear almost handsome. He had assumed the hardships of the family, leaving his brother to follow his ambitious and passionate instincts. He made himself quite insignificant beside him, saying, generally, that as he was the ugly one, he ought not to emerge from his ugliness. He added that it was excusable for Philippe to like to display his fine figure and the vigorous beauty of his countenance. Moreover, when necessary, he could be severe towards the great impetuous child, who was his senior, and whom he treated with the remonstrances and affection of a father. Their mother, now a widow, was not at all wealthy. She had a difficulty in making both ends meet on the remnants of her dowry, the major portion of which her husband had lost in business. This money, deposited at a banker's, yielded her a small income which had enabled her to bring up her 2 sons. But when they had reached man's estate, she showed them her empty hands, and placed them face to face with the difficulties of life. And the 2 brothers, thrown thus into the struggle for existence, led on by their different natures, followed diametrically opposite courses. Philippe, who had an appetite for wealth and liberty, could not bend himself to labor. He wished to attain fortune by the shortest road, and had visions of making a rich marriage. That was, in his idea, an excellent expedient, a rapid means of obtaining an income and a pretty wife. So he passed his life in the sunshine, became amorous, and even slightly dissipated. He experienced an extreme delight in being well dressed, in displaying his elegant, hasty manners, his eccentric garments, his love-laden glances and speeches about Marseille. His mother and brother, who spoiled him, endeavored to provide for his whims. Moreover, Philippe was acting in good faith. He adored women, and it seemed natural to him to be beloved and carried off some day by a rich and beautiful young girl of noble birth. Whilst his brother was exhibiting his fine looks, Marius had taken a situation as clerk in the office of M. Martelly, a ship-owner residing in the Rue de la Darse. He felt quite happy hidden away in his office, his sole ambition being to earn a modest competence and to live a peaceful and unostentatious life. Besides this, he felt a secret pleasure in assisting his mother and brother. The money he earned was dear to him because he could give it away and bestow happiness with it, and himself taste the profound delights of self-sacrifice. He had chosen in life the straight way, the painful path which leads to peace, joy, and self-respect. The young man was on the point of starting for his office when he received a letter in which his brother informed him of his elopement with Mlle. de Cazalis. It filled him with painful surprise, and he beheld at a glance the frightful chasm into the depths of which the lovers had cast themselves. He hastened without loss of time to Saint Barnabé. At the door of Ayas, the gardener's house, was a vine trained to form an arbor, whilst two big mulberry trees, pruned to the shape of parasols, spread their knotty branches around and cast their shade upon the entry. Marius found Philippe seated in the arbor, gazing lovingly upon Blanche de Cazalis beside him. The young girl, already weary, was silently regretting what they had done. The interview was a painful one, full of anguish and shame. Philippe rose up. You blame me? He asked, holding his hand out to his brother. Yes, I blame you, answered Marius energetically. You have committed a base action. Pride has led you away, and passion has ruined you. You have not thought of the evils you will bring on your family and yourself. Philippe protested. You are frightened, he said bitterly. For myself, I did not stop to consider. I loved Blanche, and she returned my love. I said to her, Will you come with me? And she came. That is the whole story. We are neither of us deserving of censure. Why lie? Replied Marius with greater severity. You're not a child, and you know very well that your duty was to protect this young lady against herself. You should have stayed her on the brink of wrong, prevented her accompanying you. Ah, don't talk to me of love. I recognize only the love of justice and duty. Philippe smiled disdainfully and drew Blanche to his breast. My poor Marius, said he, you are a good fellow, but you have never been in love, and do not understand its fever. This is my defense. And he allowed Blanche to embrace him as she clung quiveringly to him. The poor child felt well enough that her only hope was this man. She had given herself away, she belonged to him. And now she worshipped him almost as a slave, lovingly and in fear. Marius, in despair, felt that he would do no more good in talking reason to the lovers. He determined to follow his own instincts, and asked for full details of the unhappy affair. Philippe quietly answered his questions. I have known Blanche for nearly 8 months, he said. I met her first at a public festival. She was smiling in the crowd, and I fancied her smile was meant for me. Since that day I have loved her, and have sought every opportunity of meeting and addressing her. Haven't you written to her? Asked Marius. Yes, many times. Where are your letters? She has burnt them. Each time I wrote, I bought a bouquet of Fine, the florist on the Cour Saint-Louis, and slipped my letter in amongst the flowers. Marguerite, the milkwoman, used to take Blanche the bouquets. And did your letters remain unanswered? At first, yes, Blanche refused the flowers. Then she accepted them, and finally she ended by answering me. I was madly in love. I dreamed of marrying her and of loving her forever. Marius shrugged his shoulders and drew Philippe on one side. He there continued the investigation with more harshness in his voice. You are either a fool or a liar, said he quietly. You know very well that M. de Cazalis, deputy, millionaire, all-powerful in Marseille, would never have given his niece to Philippe Cayol, poor, plebeian, and republican in addition to his other drawbacks. Confess that you have reckoned on the scandal that your elopement will occasion to force Blanche's uncle to come to terms. Well, and what then? Retorted Philippe impetuously. Blanche loves me, and I have in no way forced her will. She has freely chosen me for her husband. Yes, yes, I am aware of all that. You have said it too often for me not to know how much of it I should believe. but you have not considered Monsieur de Cazalis's anger, which will fall with terrible force on you and your relations. I know the man. Last night he no doubt exhibited his outraged pride to all Marseilles. The best thing you can do is to take the young lady back to her home at Saint Joseph." "No, I will not, I cannot. Blanche would never dare return home. She had only been at the country house about a week. I was in the habit of seeing her twice a day in a little pine wood. Her uncle knew nothing, and it must have been a great shock to him. It is impossible for us to go there at present." "Well, listen, give me the letter for Abbe Chastanier. I will see him, and if necessary, will go with him to call on Monsieur de Cazalis. We must hush up the scandal. I have a task to perform, the task of repairing the wrong you have done. Promise me you will not leave this house, that you will await here my further instructions." "I promise you to wait, if no danger threatens me." Marius took Philippe's hand and looked him loyally in the face. "Love this child well," he said in a deep voice, pointing to Blanche. "You will never be able to undo the wrong you have done her." He was about to take his leave when Mademoiselle de Cazalis came forward. She clasped her hands in supplication, stifling her sobs. "If you see my uncle, sir," she stammered, "be sure and tell him that I love him. I cannot account for what has happened. I would like to remain Philippe's wife and to return to my home in his company." Marius slightly bowed. "Have hope," he said. And he went off, sad and troubled, feeling that his words were a lie, and that to hope would be madness. End of chapters 1 and 2. Part 1, Chapters 3 and 4 of The Mysteries of Marseilles by Émile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. There are menials in the church. On reaching Marseilles, Marius directed his steps to the church of Saint Victor, to which Abbe Chastanier was attached. It is one of the oldest churches in Marseilles. Its dark, high, and crenulated walls give it the appearance of a fortress. The rough people of the port hold it in particular veneration. The young fellow found the priest in the sacristy. He was a tall old man, with a long, emaciated face, pale as wax. His sad eyes had a fixed look of suffering and misery. He had just returned from a funeral, and was slowly taking off his surplice. His history was a short and sad one. Born of peasant parents, and as gentle and innocent as a child, he had taken orders to satisfy the pious wish of his mother. In becoming a priest, he had desired to perform an act of humility of absolute devotion. He believed in his simplicity that a minister of God should bury himself in the infiniteness of divine love, renounce the ambitions and intrigues of the world, and live in the heart of the sanctuary, absolving sins with one hand and dispensing charity with the other. Ah, poor Abbé! How they let him see that the simple-minded are only fit to suffer and remain in obscurity! He was soon to learn that ambition is a sacerdotal virtue, and that young priests often love God for the sake of the worldly favors that his church distributes. He beheld all his comrades of the seminary struggling tooth and nail. He assisted at these internal battles, those secret intrigues which turn a diocese into a turbulent little kingdom. And as he remained humbly on his knees, as he did not seek to please the feminine portion of the congregation, as he asked for nothing and appeared piously stupid, he was endowed with a miserable living, thrown to him as one casts a bone to a dog. He remained thus for 40 years in a little village situated between Aubagne and Cassis. His church was a kind of barn, lime-washed and icily bare. In winter, when the wind blew in one of the window panes, the interior was chilled for weeks together, for the poor priest did not always possess the few coppers necessary to replace the broken glass. Yet he never complained. He lived peacefully amidst his wretchedness and solitude. He even experienced great joy in suffering, in feeling himself kin to the beggars of his parish. He was 60 years old when one of his sisters, a workwoman at Marseilles, became an invalid. She wrote to him, beseeching him to come to her. The old priest therefore begged his bishop to find him a small place in one of the city churches. He was kept waiting the fulfillment of his modest request for several months, when at length he received a call to Saint Victor. There he had to undertake, so to say, all the roughest work, all the labor that brought least renown and least profit. He prayed over the coffins of the poor and led them to the cemetery. He even at times fulfilled the duties of a sacristan. It was at this period that he began really to suffer. So long as he had remained in his desert, he had been able to be simple, poor, and old at his ease. Now he felt that his poverty and old age, his gentleness and simplicity were looked upon as a crime. And his heart was rent when he understood that there could be menials in the church. He saw well enough that he was looked upon with derision and scorn. He bowed his head still more, becoming yet more humble, weeping over his faith, shaken by the words and deeds of the worldly priests about him. Fortunately, of an evening he had some happy moments. He nursed his sister, consoling himself in his own way by devoting himself to another. He surrounded the poor invalid with 1,000 little joys. Then another pleasure had been vouchsafed him. Monsieur de Cazalis, who had no faith in young abbes, had selected him to be his niece's spiritual adviser. The old priest seldom attracted a lady penitent, and scarcely ever heard a confession. He was moved to tears on the receipt of the deputy's proposal, and he loved Blanche as though she had been his own child. Marius handed him the young girl's letter, and watched his face for a trace of the emotions the reading of it was about to cause him. He beheld the signs of acute grief. Yet the priest did not appear to experience that surprise which results from unexpected news, and Marius concluded that Blanche had mentioned in confession her growing affection for Philippe. " You did well to count upon me, sir," said Abbe Chastanier to Marius. " But I am very weak, and not at all skilful. I should have displayed more energy." The poor man's head and hands shook with that sad, gentle trembling peculiar to old people. " I am at your disposal," he continued. " How can I assist the unhappy child?" " Sir," replied Marius, " I am the brother of the young madman who has eloped with Mademoiselle de Cazalis, and I have sworn to right the wrong, to stifle the scandal. Will you join with me? The young lady's honor is gone if her uncle has already denounced the affair to the authorities. Go therefore and find him, endeavor to calm his anger, and tell him his niece shall promptly be restored to him." " Why did you not bring her with you? I know how passionate Monsieur de Cazalis can be. Nothing but certainty will satisfy him." " It is just that anger which has frightened my brother. Besides, this is no time for reasoning. We are overwhelmed with accomplished facts. Believe me, I feel as indignant as you, and fully understand how disgraceful my brother's behavior has been. But for pity's sake, let us do something." " Very well," said the Abbe, simply. " I will go wherever you wish." They went along the Boulevard de la Corderie and reached the Cours Bonaparte, where the deputy's town house was situated. Monsieur de Cazalis, a prey to terrible anger and despair, had returned to Marseilles early in the morning following the elopement. Abbe Chastanier stopped Marius at the door of the house. " Do not come in," said he. " Your visit might be considered an insult. Let me manage, and wait for me here." Marius walked feverishly up and down the pavement for a good hour. He would have preferred to have gone in, to have explained matters himself, and have asked for pardon in Philippe's name. Whilst the fate of his family was under discussion in that house, he had to remain there, outside, inactive, and a prey to all the agony of waiting. At length Abbe Chastanier came out. He had been weeping. His eyes were red, his lips quivering. " Monsieur de Cazalis will listen to nothing," he said in a troubled voice. " I found him in a blind rage. He has already been to the Crown Attorney." The poor priest did not mention that Monsieur de Cazalis had received him with the bitterest reproaches, venting his anger upon him and accusing him in his rage of having given evil counsel to his niece. The Abbe bent beneath the storm. He almost fell on his knees, not seeking to defend himself, but imploring the deputy to take pity on the others. " Tell me all," exclaimed Marius in despair. " It appears," the priest replied, " that the man with whom your brother left his horse assisted Monsieur de Cazalis in his search. A complaint was lodged at an early hour this morning, and the police have been to ransack your lodging in the Rue Sainte, and your mother's house at Saint Just." " Good heavens ! Good heavens !" sighed Marius.
Monsieur de Cazalis swears that he will crush the whole of your family. I vainly endeavored to bring him to a kindlier frame of mind. He talks of having your mother arrested." "My mother! Whatever for?" "He makes out that she is an accomplice, that she assisted your brother in carrying off Mademoiselle Blanche." "What can we do? How prove the falsity of such an accusation?" "Ah, wretched Philippe! It will be the death of our mother." And Marius sobbed aloud, his face buried in his hands. Abbe Chastanier beheld his fit of despair with tender pity. He understood the goodness and probity of the poor lad who wept thus in the open street. "Come, my child," he said, "be courageous." "You are right, father," exclaimed Marius. "It is courage I need. I was weak this morning. I should have wrested the young lady from Philippe, and have taken her back to her uncle. An inner voice bade me perform that act of justice, and I am punished for not having obeyed its prompting. They talked to me of love, passion, and marriage, and I allowed their words to move me." They remained a moment silent, and then Marius said suddenly, "Come with me. Between us, we shall be strong enough to separate them." "I am willing," the Abbé replied. And, without even thinking to take a cab, they followed the Rue de Breteuil, the Canal Quay, the Napoleon Quay, and then ascended the Canebière. They walked hurriedly along without speaking. When they reached the Cours Saint Louis, the sound of a fresh young voice caused them to turn their heads. It was Fine, the flower girl, calling Marius. Josephine Cougourdin, familiarly known by the pet name of Fine, was one of the Marseilles brunettes, small and plump, whose refined features have preserved all the delicate purity of their Grecian ancestors. Her round head stood upon slightly drooping shoulders. Her pale face bore an expression of disdainful scorn beneath her braided black hair. Passionate energy was visible in her large, melancholy eyes, which were softened now and again by a smile. She was from 22 to 24 years of age. When only 15, she found herself an orphan with a young brother, not more than 10 years old, dependent upon her. She bravely took her mother's place, and 3 days after the funeral, whilst still suffering from her great grief, she was seated in a kiosque on the Cours Saint Louis making up and selling nosegays, sobbing the while. The little florist soon became the spoilt child of Marseilles. Her youth and grace secured her popularity. Her flowers, it was said, had a sweeter smell than those sold elsewhere. Gallants swarmed around her. She sold them her roses, violets, and carnations, but that was all. And it is thus that she was able to bring up her brother cadet and apprentice him, when 18 years old, to a master stevedore. The two young people lived on the Place aux Oeufs, in the centre of the laboring class quarter. Cadet was now a big fellow employed at the docks. Fine, grown handsomer and having arrived at womanhood, had the lively gait and careless, caressing way of Marseillaise women. She was acquainted with the Cayols through having sold them flowers, and she would speak to them with that tender familiarity which springs from the warm air and gentle language of Provence. Besides which, if all must be told, Philippe had latterly so often bought her roses, that she ended by feeling a slight tremor when he approached her. The young man, who was by instinct an admirer of the sex, laughed with her and gazed at her so intently that he made her blush, half declaring his love, the while, and all this simply not to forget the ways of wooing. The poor girl, who up till then had made short work of would-be lovers, fell a victim to this flirtation. At night time she dreamed of Philippe, and wondered with anguish whatever he could do with all the flowers she sold him. When Marius approached her, he found her high-colored and troubled. She was half hidden by her nosegays, and looked adorably fresh beneath the broad lappets of her little lace cap. "Monsieur Marius," she added, hesitatingly, "is what every one is saying this morning true? That your brother has eloped with a young lady?" "Who told you that?" asked Marius, quickly. "Why, every one. The rumor is all over the place." And as the young man seemed as troubled as herself, and stood there without speaking, Fine added with slight bitterness, "I was told that Monsieur Philippe was a flirt. His tongue was too soft for his words to be true." She was on the point of weeping, but was forcing back her tears. With painful resignation, she then added more gently, "I can see that you are in trouble. If you should need me, do not fail to let me know. Marius looked in the face, and seemed to guess the agony of her heart. "You are a brave girl," he exclaimed. "I thank you, and will perhaps avail myself of your services." He heartily shook her hand, as he would have done to a comrade, and hastened to rejoin Abbe Chastanier, who was waiting for him at the edge of the pavement. "We have no time to lose," he said. "The story is spreading all over Marseille. We must take a cab." Night was falling when they reached Saint Barnabé. They only found the gardener Ayes's wife, who was knitting in a low room. This woman quietly informed them that the gentleman and young lady had become alarmed, and had gone off on foot in the direction of Aix. She added that her son had accompanied them to guide them amongst the hills. The last hope was thus dead. Marius, completely overcome, returned to Marseille without hearing the encouraging words Abbe Chastanier addressed to him. He was thinking of the fatal consequences of Philippe's madness. He was rebelling against the misfortunes about to befall his family. "My child," said the priest as he left him, "I am only a poor man, but dispose of me as you will. I will go and pray to God for you." CHAPTER IV. How Monsieur de Cazalis avenged his niece's dishonor. The lovers had eloped on a Wednesday. On the following Friday all Marseille knew the story. The gossips on their doorsteps embellished the adventure with many dramatic details. The nobility was indignant, whilst the middle-class folk had a hearty laugh. Monsieur de Cazalis, in his rage, had done everything to increase the racket and turn his niece's flight into a frightful scandal. Clear-sighted people easily accounted for his show of anger. Monsieur de Cazalis was a deputy of the Opposition, and had been returned at Marseille by a majority composed of a few liberals, some priests, and members of the aristocracy. Devoted to the cause of legitimacy, bearing one of the most ancient names of Provence, bowing humbly before all powerful Mother Church, he had experienced considerable repugnance in flattering the liberals and receiving their votes. In his eyes they were merely varlets, servants, fit only to be whipped in the public streets. His indomitable pride suffered at the thought of lowering itself to their level. Yet he had been obliged to bow before them. The liberals noised abroad the services they were rendering, and for a time a pretence was made of disdaining their assistance; but when they talked of intervening in the election by naming one of their own party as a candidate, Monsieur de Cazalis was forced by circumstances to bury his hatred in the depths of his heart, promising himself his revenge on some future occasion. Then the most shameless jobbery was resorted to. The clergy took the field. Votes were secured right and left, thanks to innumerable civilities and promises, with the result that Monsieur de Cazalis was elected. And here was Philippe Cayol, one of the leaders of the Liberal party, fallen into his hands. At last he would be able to gratify his hatred on the person of one of the louts who had bargained with him for his return to the Chamber. He should be made to pay for all. His relatives should be ruined and plunged into despair. And as for him, he should be thrown into prison, precipitated from the height of his dream of love on to the straw of a dungeon. What! A little nobody had dared to win the love of the niece of a Cazalis? He had led her away with him, and now they were both roving along the roads, attending the hedge school of love. It was a scandal to be made much of. An ordinary person would perhaps have preferred to hush it up, to conceal the deplorable adventure as far as possible. But a Cazalis, deputy and millionaire, was possessed of sufficient influence and pride to proclaim the shame of a relative abroad without a blush. What mattered a young girl's honor? All the world might know that Blanche de Cazalis had eloped with Philippe Cayol, but no one should be able to say that she was his wife, that she had degraded herself by marrying a poor devil without a handle to his name. Pride required that the child should remain dishonored, and that her dishonor should be posted on the walls of Marseille. Monsieur de Cazalis had bills placarded in all the squares of the city, promising 10,000 francs reward to whosoever would bring him his niece and her seducer bound hand and foot. When one loses a pure-bred dog, it is also usual to advertise for it. Among the upper classes, the scandal spread still more noisily. Monsieur de Cazalis decimated his rage everywhere. He availed himself of the influence of his friends, of the clergy and nobility. As guardian of Blanche, who was an orphan, and as a trustee of her fortune, he urged on the authorities in their search, and drew up the indictment of the accused.
It might be said that he took pains to procure the greatest possible publicity for the gratis show about to begin. One of the first measures he resorted to was to secure the arrest of Philippe Cayol's mother. When the Crown attorney presented himself, she replied to all questions that she did not know her son's whereabouts. Her confusion, her anguish, her mother's fears, which made her hesitate, were no doubt considered so many proofs of complicity. She was sent to prison, more as a hostage, and possibly in the hope that her son would surrender himself in order to secure her release. When Marius heard of his mother's arrest he almost went mad. He knew she was in delicate health, and pictured her with terror shut up in a bare and icy cold cell. She would die there, tortured by all the pangs of suffering and despair. Marius was also suspected at the outset, but his firm answers and the bail that his employer, the shipowner Martelli, offered on his behalf, saved him from imprisonment. He wanted to remain free in order to work for the salvation of his family. Little by little his upright mind was able to properly weigh the facts. At first, he had been overwhelmed by Philippe's guilt, he had seen only the irreparable wrong his brother had done, and he had humbled himself, desiring solely to calm Blanche's uncle and give him every reparation possible. But, in face of the deputy's rigor, of the scandal he was raising, the young man had a revulsion of feeling. He had seen the fugitives, and knew that Blanche was voluntarily accompanying Philippe, and he was indignant at hearing the latter accused of abduction. Hard words flew around him. His brother was called a scoundrel, a villain, and his mother did not come off much better. In consequence, his love of truth prompted him to defend the lovers, to take the part of the fugitives even against the authorities. Besides which, the deputy's noisy accusations sickened him. He felt that true grief is dumb, and that an affair in which a young girl's honor is at stake should not be ventilated in public. And he felt all this, not because he wished to see his brother escape chastisement, but because his delicacy was wounded by all this publicity given to a child's shame. Moreover, he knew the meaning of the deputy's rage. By striking Philippe, he was striking far more the Republican than the abductor. Marius was thus in his turn overcome with anger. He was insulted through his family, his mother cast into prison, his brother tracked like a wild beast, his dearest affections dragged in the mud. They were the victims of bad faith and passion. At this he held up his head again. The guilt was not all on the side of the ambitious lover who had eloped with a wealthy young lady, it was equally the portion of him who was stirring up Marseille, and who intended using all his power to satisfy his pride. Since the authorities had undertaken to punish the first, Marius swore that sooner or later he would punish the second, and that in the meantime he would upset his plans and endeavor to counterbalance the influence his wealth and birth gave him. From this moment Marius displayed febrile energy, he devoted himself entirely to the preservation of his mother and brother. Unfortunately, he was unable to learn what had become of Philippe. 2 days after the flight, he had received a letter in which the fugitive implored him to send him 1,000 francs to defray the expenses of his journey. The letter was dated from Lambesc. Philippe had there found a few days' hospitality in the house of M. de Girousse, an old friend of the family. M. de Girousse, who was the son of a former member of the Parliament of Aix, was born in the midst of revolution. At his first breath he had inhaled the burning atmosphere of '89, and his blood had always preserved a little of the revolutionary fever. He felt uncomfortable in his mansion on the Cours at Aix. In his eyes the nobility of the town seemed possessed of such inordinate pride, such deplorable inertness, that he judged it severely and preferred to live at a distance from it. His upright mind, his love of logic, had helped him to accept the new order of things, and he willingly held out his hand to the people and accommodated himself to the tendencies of modern society. At one time he had thought of founding a factory, and of exchanging his title of Count for that of manufacturer, considering that nowadays the only nobility is the nobility of talent and labor. And as he preferred living alone, away from his equals, he stayed the greater part of the year on an estate he owned near the little town of Lambesc. It was there that he had harbored the fugitives. Marius was overwhelmed by Philippe's request. His savings did not amount to more than 600 francs. He bestirred himself, and during 2 days endeavored to borrow the remainder of the amount. One morning, when he was beginning to despair, Fine called upon him. He had confided his trouble to the young woman the day before. She had been for ever on his footsteps since Philippe's flight, and constantly asking for news of his brother, being apparently most anxious to know whether the young lady was still with him. Fine laid 500 francs on a table. "There," she said with a blush, "you can return it to me later on. It's some money I put aside to purchase my brother's discharge, if he was drawn in the conscription." Marius would not accept it. "You're making me waste my time," resumed Fine, with charming abruptness. "I must hurry back to my flowers. But if you don't mind, I'll call here every morning for news." And she hastened away. Marius sent the 1,000 francs. Then he heard nothing further, but passed a whole fortnight in complete ignorance of the march of events. He knew Philippe was being relentlessly hunted down, and that was all. He would not believe the grotesque or frightful stories that were current with the public. He had enough with his own fears, without being frightened at the gossip of the town. He had never in his life before suffered so much. His anxiety nearly drove him mad. The least sound frightened him. He was forever on the alert, as though expecting some bad news at any moment. He heard that Philippe had gone to Toulon and had almost been arrested there. The fugitives, it was said, had then returned to Aix. There all trace of them was lost. Had they attempted to cross the frontier? Had they remained in hiding among the hills? No one seemed to know. Marius was all the more anxious because he had been obliged to neglect his work at the shipowner Martelli's. If he had not been fixed to his desk by duty, he would have hastened to Philippe's assistance, and would have personally occupied himself with his safety. But he dared not leave the business where his services were required. M. Martelli showed him quite a paternal sympathy. A widower for several years past, and living with one of his sisters, who was 23 years of age, he treated Marius like a son. On the morrow of the scandal raised by M. de Cazalis, the shipowner called the young man into his private office. "Ah, my friend," he exclaimed, "this is a very unpleasant matter. Your brother is done for. We shall never be strong enough to save him from the terrible consequences of his folly." M. Martelli belonged to the Liberal party, and was noted for the southern violence of his opinions. He had already had some spars with M. de Cazalis, and therefore knew his man. His strict probity, his immense fortune, placed him beyond all attack. But he possessed the haughtiness of his liberalism, and took a sort of pride in never making use of his power. He advised Marius to keep quiet and await events. He would render him all his assistance once the struggle was started. Marius, consumed by his fever, was about to ask him for a leave of absence, when Fine, all in tears, appeared one morning before him. "The gentleman has been arrested," she exclaimed between her sobs. "They found him with the young lady in a cottage in the Trois Bons Dieux quarter, about a league from Aix." And as Marius, greatly agitated, rushed downstairs to make inquiries, which only too fully bore out the truth of Fine's statement, she, still in tears, smiled and said in a low voice, "At any rate, the young lady is no longer with him." End of chapters 3 and 4. Part 1, chapters 5 and 6 of the Mysteries of Marseilles by Émile Zola, translated by Ernest, Alfred, Vizetelly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Blanche journeys 6 leagues on foot, and sees a procession pass by. Blanche and Philippe left the gardener's house at dusk at about 7:30. During the day they had noticed gendarmes on the road. They were assured that they would be arrested that evening, and fright drove them from this their first retreat. Philippe put on a peasant's blouse, whilst Blanche borrowed a workwoman's dress from the gardener's wife, a red cotton gown with a flowery pattern and a black apron. She put a yellow check fichu round her breast and a big coarse straw hat on her head. Victor, the son of the house, a lad of 15, accompanied them, to show them the way across the fields to the Aix road. The warm night air was full of murmurs. A hot breath rose from the earth, counteracting the fresh breeze which was wafted now and again from the Mediterranean. A bright light, like the reflection of a fire, still illumined the west. The rest of the sky was of a violet blue, gradually growing paler in color, while the stars appeared one by one in the night, similar to the flickering lights of a distant town. The fugitives hastened along with bowed heads, and without exchanging a word. They were in a hurry to find themselves amidst the solitude of the hills. So long as they were crossing the outskirts of Marseilles, they met a few passers-by whom they eyed with distrust. At last the open country spread out before them, and the only human beings they encountered were now and again some grave shepherds standing at the edge of the path, watching their flocks. And their flight continued in the gloom and the emotional silence of the serene night. Vague sounds floated around them. Pebbles rolled beneath their feet with a noise that filled them with uneasiness. The sleeping countryside extended like a black mass in the monotony of the darkness. Blanche, affrighted, clung to Philippe, hastening her little footsteps in order to keep up with him. She heaved deep sighs as she recalled the peacefulness of her nights at home. Then they reached the hills, with the deep ravines which had to be crossed. Around Marseilles the roads are soft and easy, but out in the country one meets those rocky ridges which cut up the whole centre of Provence into narrow, sterile valleys. Uncultivated plains, stony slopes, with here and there some sorry tufts of thyme and lavender, now extended before the fugitives in all their desolate mournfulness. The paths wound up and down the sides of the hills. Fallen rock now and again blocked the way. Beneath the bluish serenity of the heavens, one could have fancied it a sea of pebbles, an ocean of stones stricken with eternal immobility in the midst of a hurricane. Victor, leading the way, softly whistled a Provençal air as he jumped from rock to rock with the agility of a chamois. He had grown up amid this desert, and was acquainted with its innermost recesses. Blanche and Philippe followed him laboriously. The young man was supporting the girl, whose feet were cut by the sharp stones on the way. She did not complain, and whenever her lover gazed inquiringly into her face in the transparent darkness, she smiled to him with sad sweetness. They had just passed Septembre, when the young girl, worn out, sank to the ground. The moon, slowly rising in the heavens, lit up her pale face, bathed in tears. Philippe bent over her in great distress. " You are crying," he exclaimed. " You are in pain, my poor, darling child. Ah, it was cowardly of me to keep you with me, was it not?" " Do not say that, Philippe," replied Blanche. " I am weeping because I am a miserable girl. See, I can scarcely walk. We should have done better to have fallen on our knees before my uncle, and have implored him with clasped hands." She regained her feet with an effort, and they continued their journey over the arid hills. It was far different from the gay and foolish escapade of a couple of lovers. It was a dismal flight, full of anxiety, the flight of a guilty couple, silent and quaking with fear. They traversed the Gardanne district, struggling during 5 hours against the obstacles of the way. At last they decided to descend to the high road leading to Aix, and there they were able to proceed more freely. The dust, however, nearly blinded them. When they reached the top of the Arc hill, they dismissed Victor. Blanche had covered 6 leagues among the rocks on foot in less than 6 hours. She sat down on a stone seat at the gate of the town, and declared that she could not proceed any further. Philippe, who feared to be arrested if he remained at Aix, went in search of a vehicle. He came across a woman driving a light cart who agreed to give him and Blanche a lift as far as Lambesc, whither she was bound. In spite of the jolting, Blanche fell into a sound sleep, and did not wake up until they were nearing their destination. This sleep calmed the fever of her blood. She felt soothed and stronger. The lovers alighted from the vehicle just as day was breaking, a fresh and radiant dawn, which filled them with hope. The terrors of the night had vanished. The fugitives had forgotten the Septembre rocks, and were walking side by side in the damp grass, intoxicated with their youth and love. Not finding Monsieur de Girousse, of whom Philippe had intended asking hospitality, they went to an inn, where they were at last able to enjoy a day of peace. On the morrow Philippe saw Monsieur de Girousse, who had returned. He told him the whole story, and asked his advice. " The deuce !" exclaimed the old nobleman. " Your matter is serious. You know, my friend, you're but a clodhopper. 100 years ago Monsieur de Cazalis would have hanged you for daring to touch his niece. Nowadays he can only have you cast in prison, and you may be sure he won't omit to do so." " But what had I better do now ?"" What had you better do ? Why, restore the young lady to her uncle, and make for the frontier as fast as you can." " You know very well that I shall never do that." " Very well. Then just wait quietly until you're arrested. I've no other advice to give you.
So there." Beneath a friendly abruptness, Monsieur de Girousse hid the kindest heart in the world. As Philippe, confused by the curtness of his reception, was about to take his departure, he called him back, and taking his hand, continued with slight bitterness: "My duty would be to have you arrested. I belong to that nobility you have just insulted. Listen, I have somewhere on the other side of Lambesc a little unoccupied house of which I will give you the key. Go and hide yourselves there, but don't tell me you're going to do so. If you do, I'll send the gendarmes after you." It was thus the lovers remained nearly a week at Lambesc. They lived in retirement, amid a peacefulness broken at times by sudden alarms. Philippe had received 1,000 francs Marius had sent him. Blanche was becoming quite a little housekeeper, and they ate out of the same plate with delight. This new life was like a dream to the young girl. At times, however, she would wonder why she had gone off with Philippe. She would then experience a revulsion of feeling, and wish to return to her uncle, but she never dared say so. It was then the time of the feast of Corpus Christi. One afternoon, as Blanche was looking out of the window, she saw a procession pass by. She knelt down and joined her hands and fancied she could see herself dressed in white amongst the singers. Her heart was bursting. That night Philippe received an anonymous letter warning him that he would be arrested on the morrow. He thought he recognized Monsieur de Girousse's handwriting. The flight was resumed, more difficult and painful. Chapter 6. The hunt after the lovers. Then ensued a regular rout, a race without truce or repose, an ever-recurring panic. Driven right and left by their fright, perpetually fancying they could hear the sound of horses' hoofs behind them, passing their nights hurrying along the highways and their days trembling in the filthy rooms of country inns, the fugitives crossed and recrossed the whole of Provence, going before them and retracing their footsteps, not knowing where to find an unknown retreat hidden on the confines of some desert. They left Lambesc one terribly stormy night, and went in the direction of Avignon. They had hired a little cart, and the wind nearly blinded their horse. Blanche was shivering in her thin cotton dress. To complete their wretchedness, they thought they could see from a distance, at one of the gates of the town, some gendarmes examining the faces of the passers-by. Thoroughly frightened, they retraced their steps and returned to Lambesc, through which they only passed. Arrived at Aix, they did not dare stay there, and resolved to reach the frontier at no matter what cost. There they would procure themselves a passport and be in safety. Philippe, who knew a chemist at Toulon, decided to pay a visit to that town. He expected that his friend would be able to assist him in his flight. The chemist, a big, merry fellow named Jourdan, received them very well. He hid them in his own room, and promised to at once try and obtain them a passport. Jourdan was gone out, when 2 gendarmes called. Blanche nearly fainted away. White as a ghost, and seated in a corner, she was stifling her sobs. Philippe, in a choking voice, asked the gendarmes what they wanted. "Are you Monsieur Jourdan?" one of them inquired, with a roughness which forebode nothing good. "No," replied the young man, "Monsieur Jourdan is out, but will soon be back." "Very well," said the gendarme curtly, and he seated himself heavily. The poor lovers scarcely dared look at each other. They felt fit to faint away in the presence of these men who had, no doubt, come after them. Their anguish lasted a good half-hour. At length Jourdan returned. He paled at the sight of the gendarmes, and answered their questions with the greatest confusion. "You must come with us," said one of the men. "What for?" he asked. "What am I accused of?" "You are charged with having cheated at cards last night in a club. You will be able to give your explanations when before the magistrate." A shudder passed through Jourdan's frame. He was quite dazed, and accompanied the gendarmes with the docility of a child. They went off without even perceiving the terror of the lovers. Jourdan's affair made a great sensation at Toulon at the time, but no one knew of the painful drama which had been enacted at the chemist's the day of his arrest. This event took all the courage out of Philippe. He understood that he was not strong enough to evade the police who were on his track. Besides, he had now no longer any hope of obtaining a passport, and would therefore be unable to cross the frontier. Moreover, he saw that Blanche's strength was giving away. He therefore determined to return towards Marseilles, and wait in the neighborhood of the city until Monsieur de Cazalis's anger was partly appeased. Like all those who have no longer any ground for hope, He had at times ridiculous visions of pardon and happiness. Philippe had a relation at Aix named Isnard, who kept a draper's shop. Not knowing where to obtain hospitality, the fugitives returned to Aix to ask Isnard for the key of one of his cottages. A fatality pursued them. The draper was away, and they were obliged to hide themselves in an old house on the Cours Sextius belonging to a cousin of M. de Girousse's farmer. This woman would not at first receive them, fearing she might be called to account later on for her hospitality. She only yielded before Philippe's promises to procure her son's exemption from military service. The young man was no doubt in a hopeful frame of mind. He could already see himself a deputy's nephew, and was disposing freely of his uncle's great influence. That evening Isnard came to the lovers and handed them the key of a cottage he owned in the Puricard plain. He had two others, one at Tolonais, and the other in the district of Trois Bon Dieu. The keys of these were hidden under certain great stones, which he described to them. He advised them not to remain 2 nights running beneath the same roof, and promised to do his best to put the police off their track. They started off, and took the road which passes beside the hospital. Isnard's cottage was situated to the right of Puricard, between the village and the road leading to Venelle. It was one of those ugly little buildings formed of lime-washed stones without mortar, and enlivened by a roof of red tiles. It contained but one room, little better than a dirty stable. Straw refuse littered the ground, and great cobwebs hung from the ceiling. They had fortunately brought a rug with them. They gathered the litter into a corner and spread the rug over the heap. This formed their couch amid the acrid exhalations of the dampness surrounding them. On the morrow they passed the day in a hole in a dried-up watercourse called the Touloubre. Then, towards evening, they gained the Venelle road, and reached Tolonais by a roundabout way in order to avoid passing through Aix. It was 11 o'clock when they arrived at the draper's cottage, situated below the Jesuit oratory. This cottage was rather better. It had 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a parlor, which latter contained a fold-up bedstead. The walls were covered with caricatures cut out of the Charivari, and strings of onions hung from the whitewashed beams. The lovers could almost fancy themselves in a palace. In the morning their fright returned. They climbed the hill and remained till night-time in the recesses of the Infernets. In those days the precipices of Jaumegarde still possessed all their sinister horror. The Zola canal had not then pierced the mountain, and strollers did not often venture into that dismal abyss of reddish rocks. Blanche and Philippe enjoyed profound peacefulness in the midst of this desert. They rested long beside a clear and murmuring spring which trickled from a gigantic mass of rock. At nightfall returned the cruel question of shelter. Blanche could now scarcely walk. Her wounded feet bled upon the sharp and pointed stones. Philippe understood he could not take her much farther. He supported her, and they slowly ascended to the level ground overlooking the Infernets. It is an extensive uncultivated plain, vast fields of pebbles, waste land broken up here and there by disused quarries. Nothing looks so strangely wild as this broad landscape with its bare horizon dotted here and there with a dark and stunted vegetation. The rocks, looking like distorted limbs, pierce above the barren earth. The plain, having the appearance of a humpback, seems to have been stricken with death in the midst of the convulsions of a terrible agony. Philippe hoped to find some hole, some cavern. He had the good luck to discover a shanty, one of those shelters in which sportsmen hide themselves while awaiting the flight of birds of passage. He did not hesitate to force in the door, and seated Blanche upon a little bench he felt beneath his hand. Then he went and gathered a quantity of thyme. The plain is covered with this humble grey plant, the strong perfume of which rises from every hill of Provence. He carried the thyme into the shelter, and spread it in the form of a mattress over which he laid the rug. The bed was ready, and the fugitives kissed each other good night upon this miserable couch. Philippe was unable to sleep. The strong smell of the thyme upon which he was lying affected his brain. He dreamt, in spite of his wakefulness, that M. de Cazalis had received him affectionately, and that he had been elected deputy in his uncle's stead. Now and again he could hear Blanche's mournful sighs as she slumbered beside him, agitated and feverish. The young girl had come to consider her flight some nightmare full of bitter pleasures. During the day she was rendered stupid by fatigue. She smiled sadly, and never complained. Her inexperience had caused her to agree to the flight, and her weak character prevented her proposing to return. She belonged, body and soul, to this man who carried her along. All she wished was to have to walk less. She continued to believe that her uncle would consent to her marriage, when his temper had cooled. The fugitives left their bed of thyme at sunrise. Their clothes were becoming terribly torn, and their shoes were nearly worn out. In the coolness of the morning, amid the wild perfumes of this solitude, they forgot their wretchedness for a time, and declared laughingly that they were frightfully hungry. So Philippe told Blanche to go back to the hut, and hurried off to Toulonnais in search of food. It took him a good half-hour. When he returned he found the girl in a state of terror. She assured him she had seen some wolves prowling about. The table was laid on a large flat stone, and they were like a couple of gypsy lovers breakfasting in the open air. After breakfast they made for the centre of the plain, and remained there all day. These were some of their happiest hours. But when the twilight fell, fear again seized them. They dreaded to pass another night amidst all that solitude. The pure warm air of the hills had filled them with gentler thoughts and hopes. " You are tired, my poor child? " asked Philippe. " Oh, yes," she replied. " Listen, we must perform one more journey. Let us go as far as Isnard's cottage, in the Trois Bon Dieu district, and remain there until your uncle forgives us, or has me arrested." My uncle will forgive us." I dare not think it. In any case, I will no longer fly. You have need of rest. Come, let us walk slowly." They crossed the plain, leaving the Infernese behind them, and passing the Chateau of St. Marc, which they could see on an eminence on their right. They reached their destination at the end of an hour. Isnard's cottage was on the slope of the hill which stretches to the left of the Vauvenargues road after one has passed the Repentance Glen. It was a small, one-storied house. The ground floor consisted of a single room containing a rickety table and 3 old rush-bottomed chairs. A ladder led to the upper room, a kind of loft almost entirely bare, and containing merely a wretched mattress on a heap of hay. Isnard had considerately placed a sheet at the foot of the mattress. Philippe's intention was to go on the morrow to Aix and procure information as to Monsieur de Cazalis' intentions towards him. He felt that he would be unable to hide himself any longer. He went to rest in an almost peaceful frame of mind, calmed by Blanche's kind words as she judged events with all a young girl's hopefulness. It was now 20 days that the fugitives had been running about the country, and during this time the gendarmes had been scouring the neighborhood, following on their track, sometimes losing it, but always getting set right again by some slight circumstance. The deputy's anger had only increased with the delay. His pride was irritated by each fresh obstacle. At Lambesc, the gendarmes came a few hours too late. The arrival of the fugitives at Toulon was not known until the morrow of their return to Aix. Everywhere they escaped as though by a miracle. The deputy ended by accusing the police of being lukewarm. He was informed at last that the lovers were in the neighborhood of Aix, and that they were on the point of being arrested. He hastened there to assist in the search. The woman of the Cour Sextius, who had given them hospitality for a few hours, was seized with terror. To avoid being accused of complicity, she told all she knew, and said that they were probably hidden in one of Isnard's cottages. Isnard, who was questioned, quietly denied everything. He declared that he had not seen his relative for several months past. This was happening at the very time Philippe and Blanche were entering the cottage in the Trois Bon Dieu district. The draper was unable to warn the lovers during the night. At 5 o'clock the next morning, a police commissary called on him, and informed him that he was going to search his house and 3 cottages. Monsieur de Cazalis remained at Aix, saying he was afraid he would kill his niece's abductor if he ever met him face to face. The officers sent to search the cottage at Féricard found the nest empty. Isnard obligingly offered to lead 2 gendarmes to his place at Toulonnais, feeling certain that they would waste their time. The police commissary, also accompanied by 2 gendarmes, went to the Trois Bon Dieu. He took a locksmith with him, Isnard having vaguely stated that the key of the cottage was hidden under a stone on the right of the door. It was about 6 o'clock when the commissary arrived there. Everything was closed, and not a sound came from inside. He went forward, and hammering on the door with his fist, exclaimed in a loud voice, "Open, in the name of the law!" Echo alone answered. Nothing stirred.
After waiting a few minutes, the commissary turned towards the locksmith, saying, "Pick the lock." The locksmith selected his tools, and the grating of the iron could soon be heard in the silence. The shutter of a window was then violently thrown back, and Philippe Cayol, disdainful and angry, his neck and arms bare, appeared in the bright light of the rising sun. "What do you want?" he asked, leaning on the window sill. The first blow struck by the commissary had awoke the fugitives. Seated on the edge of the mattress, still half asleep, they listened anxiously to the voices without. The words, "in the name of the law," that cry which rings so terribly in the ears of the guilty, struck the young man full in the chest. He jumped up, quivering, bewildered, not knowing what to do. The young girl, huddled up in the sheet, her eyes still heavy with sleep, was shedding tears of shame and despair. Philippe understood that all was over, and that he had only to surrender himself. But a dull feeling of revolt rose within him. So his dreams were dead, he would never be Blanche's husband, he had carried off an heiress to be himself cast into jail. Instead of the happy existence he had dreamed of, he ended by gaining a prison cell. Then a cowardly thought passed through his mind. It occurred to him to leave the girl there and fly in the direction of Vauvenargues, in the defiles of Sainte Victoire. Perhaps he could escape by a window at the back of the cottage. He bent over Blanche, and in a low, hesitating voice, told her of his project. The young girl, half stifled by her sobs, did not understand nor even hear him. He saw with anguish that she was not in a state to assist his flight. At this moment he heard the sound of the workman picking the lock. The poignant drama that had just been enacted in that bare room had lasted at most a minute. He felt himself lost, and his chafed pride restored his courage. Had he been armed, he would have defended himself. But conscious that he was no abductor, Blanche having accompanied him voluntarily, he felt that he had nothing to be ashamed of. So he angrily pushed back the shutter, and asked what was wanted. "Open the door," ordered the police commissary. "We will tell you afterwards what we want." Philippe went down and opened the door. "Are you Monsieur Philippe Cayol?" resumed the commissary. "Yes," replied the young man, energetically. "Then I arrest you on the charge of abduction. You have carried off a young girl under 16 years of age, who is no doubt hidden here with you." Philippe smiled and said, "Mademoiselle Blanche de Cazalis is upstairs, and can tell you if I used any violence towards her. I don't know what you mean by talking of abduction. I was about to go this very day to Monsieur de Cazalis and ask him for his niece's hand in marriage." Blanche, pale and shivering, had just come down the ladder. She had dressed herself hastily. "Mademoiselle," said the commissary, "I have orders to take you to your uncle, who is awaiting you at Aix. He is in great grief." "I am deeply sorry for having displeased my uncle," replied Blanche, with some firmness. "But you must not accuse Monsieur Cayol, whom I accompanied of my own free will." And deeply affected, on the point of again bursting into sobs, she turned towards the young man and continued, "Have hope, Philippe. I love you, and will beseech my uncle to be good to us. Our separation will only last a few days." Philippe looked at her sadly and shook his head. "You are a weak and timid child," he replied slowly. Then he added, in a harsher tone, "Remember only that you belong to me. If you forsake me, you will find me ever in your life, the recollection of my kisses will never cease scorching your lips, and that will be your punishment." She was weeping. "Love me well, as I love you," he resumed more gently. The police commissary placed Blanche in a carriage he had brought to the spot, and took her back to Aix, whilst the 2 gendarmes marched Philippe off and placed him in the prison of the town. End of chapters 5 and 6. Part 1, chapters 7 and 8 of the Mysteries of Marseilles by Émile Zola, translated by Ernest, Alfred, Vizetelly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Blanche denies her love. The news of the arrest did not reach Marseilles until the following day, and caused quite a sensation. Monsieur de Cazalis was observed driving along the Canebière in the afternoon, accompanied by his niece. The gossips had their fill. Everyone spoke of the deputy's triumphant attitude, and of Blanche's shame and embarrassment. Monsieur de Cazalis was capable of dragging his niece throughout Marseille, to show the people she had returned to his protection, and that no woman of his race would marry beneath her. Marius, informed by Fine, was out and about all day. The common talk of the town confirmed the tidings, and he was able to pick up all the details of the arrest. In a few hours the event had become legendary, and the shopkeepers, the idlers and loafers related it as though it had been the marvellous tale of something that had happened a century before. The young man, tired of hearing these cock-and-bull stories, went to his office, his head aching and his brain incapable of deciding what course to pursue. Unfortunately, Monsieur Martelly would be away until the following evening, and Marius felt the need of doing something at once. He would have liked to have immediately taken some steps that would have reassured him as to his brother's fate. His first alarm had now, however, partly subsided. He reflected that after all his brother could not be accused of abduction, and that Blanche would be there to defend him. He ended by naively imagining that it was his duty to call upon Monsieur de Cazalis and ask him for his niece's hand in Philippe's name. On the following morning he dressed himself in black, and was going out when Fine came as usual. The poor girl turned quite pale when Marius told her what he was about to do. "Will you permit me to accompany you?" she asked, in a beseeching tone of voice. "I will wait outside to learn the answer of the young lady and her uncle." She followed Marius, and when they arrived at the Cours Bonaparte, the young man walked firmly to the deputy's house and sent up his name. Monsieur de Cazalis's blind passion had now subsided. He held his vengeance. He would be able to prove his might by crushing one of those republicans whom he detested. Now his sole desire was to taste the joy of playing with his prey. So he ordered that Monsieur Marius Cayol should be admitted. He expected tears, earnest supplications. The young man found him standing up haughtily in the centre of a vast saloon. He advanced towards him, and without giving him time to speak, said, calmly and politely, "I have the honor to ask you, sir, in the name of my brother, Monsieur Philippe Cayol, for the hand of your niece, Mademoiselle Blanche de Cazalis." The deputy was thunderstruck. Marius's request seemed to him so absurdly extravagant that it failed to anger him. He stepped back, looking the young man straight in the face, and answered with a disdainful laugh, "You must be mad, sir. I know that you are an industrious and honest fellow, and it is for that reason that I do not have you put out. Your brother is a scoundrel, a knave, who shall be punished as he deserves. What do you want with me?" On hearing his brother insulted, Marius felt a great desire to strike the noble personage as one of the rabble would have done. He restrained himself, however, and continued, in a voice that was beginning to tremble with emotion, "I have already told you, sir, I am here to offer Mademoiselle de Cazalis the only reparation possible, that is to say, marriage. The wrong that has been done her can thus be effaced." "We are above any wrong," exclaimed the deputy with contempt. "The shame for a Cazalis is not that she has had anything to do with a Philippe Cayol. Her shame would be to ally herself to such people as you. Such people as we have other ideas as regards honor. However, I will not dwell upon it. My duty alone prompted me to offer you the reparation you refuse. Permit me merely to add that your niece would no doubt accept this offer if I had the honor of making it to her in person." "You think so?" said Monsieur de Cazalis sarcastically. He rang the bell, and requested the servant to ask his niece to come to him at once. Blanche entered, pale-faced and red-eyed, looking worn out by her too powerful emotions. She shuddered on beholding Marius. "Mademoiselle," said her uncle coldly, "this gentleman has asked for your hand on behalf of the scoundrel whose name I will not pronounce in your presence. Tell the gentleman what you told me yesterday." Blanche reeled. She dared not look at Marius. Her eyes fixed upon her uncle, her whole frame trembling, she murmured in a weak and hesitating voice, "I told you I had been carried off by force, and that I would do all in my power to secure the punishment of the odious attempt made upon me." These words were uttered like a lesson learnt beforehand. Blanche denied her love. Monsieur de Cazalis had not lost his time. As soon as his niece was in his power, he influenced her with all the weight of his obstinacy and pride.
She alone could secure his ultimate success. It was necessary that she should lie and stifle her feelings, that she should become a compliant and passive instrument in his hands. During 4 hours he kept her under the spell of his sharp, cold words. He was not so foolish as to give vent to his rage. He spoke with crushing haughtiness, recalling the ancient origin of his race, displaying his wealth and power. He skilfully showed her on the one hand the picture of a vulgar and ridiculous marriage, and on the other the noble joys of a rich and great alliance. He attacked the young girl through her vanity, tired her out, broke her spirit, dulled her intellect, and rendered her such as he desired, tractable and inert. Blanche emerged from this long interview, this continuous martyrdom, utterly vanquished. Perhaps, beneath the sting of her uncle's overpowering words, her patrician blood had at length revolted at the memory of Philippe's vulgar love. Perhaps her childhood dreams were called upon as the deputy descanted on luxurious costumes, worldly elegance, and honours of all kinds. Moreover, her head was too bad, her heart too sore for her to resist that terrible will. Every sentence Monsieur de Cazalis uttered struck her, crushed her, filled her with painful anxiety. She no longer felt the power of having a will of her own. She had loved and accompanied Philippe through weakness. Now she was turning against him also through weakness. She was ever the same timid being. She accepted everything and promised everything. She longed to escape from the stifling weight with which her uncle's words were crushing her. On hearing her make her strange declaration, Marius stood amazed and terrified. He remembered the young girl's attitude when at Hayes the gardener's. He could recall her clinging to Philippe's neck, loving and confiding. "Ah, mademoiselle," he exclaimed bitterly, "the odious attempt you speak of did not seem to fill you with such abhorrence the day you beseeched me to implore your uncle's pardon and consent. Have you reflected that your falsehood will cause the ruin of the man you perhaps still love, and who should be your husband?" Blanche, now erect, her lips tightly drawn together, was looking vaguely in front of her. "I do not know what you mean," she stammered. "I have told no falsehood. I yielded to force. That man took advantage of me, and my uncle will avenge the honour of our family." Marius drew himself up. Dignified anger increased his short stature, and his feeling of justice and truth made his thin face appear handsome. He looked around him contemptuously, and said, slowly, "And yet I am in the home of the Cazalis, of the descendants of that illustrious family which is the glory of Provence. I had no idea that falsehood dwelt in this abode. I never expected to find calumny and cowardice lodging here side by side. Oh, you shall hear me to the end. I intend to cast my lackey's dignity in the teeth of my unworthy superiors." Turning towards the deputy, he continued, as he pointed to the trembling girl, "That child is innocent, and I forgive her weakness. But you, sir, you are a clever man. You safeguard the honour of your women by making them untruthful and faint-hearted. Were you now to offer me the hand of Mademoiselle Blanche de Cazalis for my brother, I should refuse it, for I have never lied. I have never been guilty of a base action, and I should blush to be allied to such people as you." Monsieur de Cazalis bent beneath the young man's rage. At the first insult he had summoned a big valet, who stood at the open door. As he signed to him to put Marius into the street, the latter resumed, with terrible energy, "I swear I will shout out murder if this man moves a foot. Let me pass. One day, sir, I may be able to fling in your face before all the world the truths I have just told you in this room." And he walked out slowly and firmly. He no longer thought of Philippe's guilt. His brother had become in his eyes a victim whom he was determined to save and avenge at no matter what cost. In this upright nature, the slightest untruth or injustice raised a tempest. Already the scandal stirred up by Monsieur de Cazalis at the time of the elopement had caused him to take the fugitive's part. Now that Blanche lied and the deputy resorted to calumny, he longed to be all-powerful, in order to proclaim the truth from the housetops. Fine, a prey to anxiety, was waiting for him outside. "Well?" asked the young woman as soon as she caught sight of him. "Well," he replied, "those people are miserable liars and vain fools.
Fine drew a deep breath, whilst a blush spread over her cheeks. So, she resumed, Monsieur Philippe is not to marry the young lady? The young lady, said Marius, smiling bitterly, pretends that Philippe is a scoundrel who carried her off by force. My brother is lost. Fine did not understand. She bowed her head, wondering how the young lady could treat her lover as a scoundrel. And she thought how happy she would have been had Philippe carried her off even by force. Marius's anger delighted her. The marriage would never take place. Your brother is lost, she murmured in a soft, wheedling voice. Oh, I will save him, or rather, we will save him together. Chapter 8. The iron pot against the earthen ewer. When Marius told Monsieur Martelli that evening of the interview he had had with Monsieur de Cazalis, the ship-owner said as he shook his head, I do not know what advice to give you, my friend. I do not wish to drive you to despair, but you will be conquered, take my word for it. Your duty is to enter upon the struggle, and I will assist you to the best of my ability. Yet we had better admit to each other that we are weak and unarmed in the presence of an adversary who has the clergy and nobility behind him. Marseille and Aix have little love for the July monarchy, and these two towns are both wholly devoted to a deputy of the opposition which is waging such a war against Monsieur Thiers. They will assist Monsieur de Cazalis in his revenge. I am alluding to the bigwigs. The common people would help us if they were able to help anyone. The best thing would be to win over some influential member of the clergy to our cause. Do you know any priest who is in favor with our bishop? Marius replied that he only knew Abbe Chastanier, a poor old man who certainly possessed no influence. Never mind, go and see him, said the ship-owner. The townspeople cannot be of any use to us. The nobility would show us the door if we asked their assistance, so there is only the church left. That is where we must apply. Begin your campaign. I shall be busy on my side also. On the following morning Marius went to St. Victor, where Abbe Chastanier received him with a sort of timid embarrassment. Don't ask me to do anything, he exclaimed at the first words the young man uttered. It is known that I have already occupied myself with this affair, and I have had to endure some grave reproaches. I told you before, I am only a poor man. I can only pray for you. Marius was affected by the old man's humble attitude, and was about to withdraw, when the priest detained him and said in a low voice, Listen, there is a man here, Abbé Donadei, who might be useful to you. It is said that he is on the best of terms with his lordship. He is a foreign priest, an Italian, I think, who has won everybody's goodwill in a few months. He stopped speaking, hesitating, and seeming to be inquiring of himself. The worthy man was thinking that he was about to compromise himself terribly, but he could not resist the joy of doing a kindness. Would you like me to take you to him? He asked suddenly. Marius, who had perceived his slight hesitation, sought to decline. But the old man insisted, forgetting entirely his personal tranquillity, listening only to the promptings of his heart. Come, he resumed. Abbé Donadei lives only a short distance off, on the Boulevard de la Corderie. After a few minutes' walk, Abbé Chastanier stopped at a little one-storied house, one of those discreet dwellings which have a vague air of the confessional about them. Here we are, said he to Marius. An old woman servant opened the door, and conducted them to a small apartment with dark hangings, resembling some austere boudoir. Abbé Donadei received them with easy grace. His pale face, with delicate features, bore a slightly cunning expression, and did not show the least surprise. He drew some chairs forward in a coaxing manner, his body half bent, a slight smile about his lips, doing the honors of his study, like a lady does those of her drawing-room. He wore a long black robe, loose at the waist. But this severe costume covered coquettish manners. His delicate white hands appeared quite small as they issued from the ample sleeves, and his clean-shaven face had a soft, fresh complexion beneath the curly locks of his chestnut-colored hair. He looked about 30 years of age. When he had seated himself in an armchair, he listened with smiling gravity to what Marius had to say. He made him repeat all the spicier details of Blanche's elopement, and the story seemed to interest him immensely. Abbé Donadei was born at Rome, and had an uncle who was cardinal. One fine day his uncle suddenly packed him off to France without anybody knowing exactly why. On his arrival, the handsome Abbé found himself obliged to enter the ex-seminary as a teacher of living languages. Such an humble position so humiliated him that he fell ill. The Cardinal relented, and recommended his nephew to the Bishop of Marseille. His ambition satisfied, Donadei quickly recovered. He joined the clergy of St. Victor, and, as Abbé Chastanier had naively said, he succeeded in winning everybody's goodwill in a few months. His caressing Italian nature, his soft pink face, turned him into a cherub in the eyes of the demure lady devotees of the parish. He was especially successful in the pulpit. His slight foreign accent gave a strange charm to his sermons, and when he spread out his arms, he knew how to cause his hands to tremble with an emotion which filled the eyes of his congregation with tears. Like most Italians, he was a born intriguer. He used and abused his uncle's recommendation to the Bishop of Marseille, and soon became a power, an occult power working underground, and digging pitfalls in front of those persons he desired to remove from his path. Joining a religious club, then all-powerful at Marseille, he succeeded in imposing his will on his colleagues, thanks to his suppleness, his perpetual smile and humility, and in becoming the leader of a party. Then he interested himself in every event, had a finger in every pie. It was he who secured M. de Cazalis' election as deputy, and he was awaiting a fitting opportunity to claim the reward of his services. His plan was to work for the success of wealthy people. Later on, when he had merited their gratitude, he intended to make use of them in building up his own fortune. He questioned Marius courteously. By the attention he paid him and his sympathetic manner, he seemed fully disposed to assist him in his work of deliverance. The young man allowed himself to be taken in by this pleasant, amiable behavior, and unburdened himself, relating his plans, and owning that the clergy alone could save his brother. Finally, he begged his kind offices with his lordship, the bishop. Abbé Donadei rose and said in a tone of austere raillery, "My cloth, sir, forbids my mixing myself up in this deplorable and scandalous affair. The enemies of the Church are only too fond of accusing the clergy of interfering in worldly affairs. I can only beseech the Almighty to pardon your brother." Marius in dismay had also risen. He understood that he had just been duped by Donadei. He sought, however, to disguise his feelings. "I thank you," he replied. "Prayers are indeed the sweetest of alms for the unfortunate. Pray that we may be granted the justice of our fellow men." He turned towards the door, followed by Abbé Chastanier with bowed head. Donadei had affected to ignore the old priest. When they were on the point of leaving the room, the handsome Abbé, recovering all his graceful sprightliness, detained Marius a moment. "You are employed at Monsieur Martelly's, I think?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the young man answered, with surprise. "He is a very honorable man. I know, however, that he is not one of our friends. Nevertheless, I esteem him greatly. His sister, Mademoiselle Claire, whose spiritual director I have the honor of being, is one of our best parishioners." And as Marius looked at him, finding nothing to say, Donadei added, with a slight blush, "She is a charming person, most exemplarily pious." He bowed with an exquisite politeness, and then gently closed the door. Outside on the pavement, Abbé Chastanier and Marius looked at each other, and the young man could not help shrugging his shoulders. The old priest was quite confused at having seen one of God's ministers play a part like an actor. He turned to his companion and said, hesitatingly, "My friend, you must not blame the Almighty if His ministers are not always what they should be. The young man we have just been with is only guilty of ambition." He continued a long time in this strain, finding excuses for Donadei. Marius watched him, affected by his goodness, and in spite of himself he compared this poor old man to the powerful Abbé whose smiles were law in the diocese. Then he reflected that the Church did not love all her sons equally, but, like most mothers, spoilt the rosy-cheeked ones, and neglected the tender spirits who did good by stealth. The two visitors were moving off when a carriage drew up at the door of the closed, discreet little house, and Marius beheld M. de Cazalis alight. The deputy hastily entered Abbé Donadei's abode. "Look, father," exclaimed the young man, "I feel certain that priest's cloth will not prevent his abetting M. de Cazalis in his vengeance." He was tempted to return to that home of hypocrisy. but, calming himself, he thanked Abbe Chastanier and went off. He thought with despair that the last loophole of safety, the one in possession of the upper clergy, was closing before him. On the morrow, M. Martelly told him the result of a visit he had paid to the chief notary of Marseille, M. Douglas, a pious man who in less than 8 years had become quite a power through his wealthy clients and his great charity. His name was loved and respected. People spoke admiringly of the virtues of this upright worker who led a frugal life, unlimited confidence was placed in his honesty and the activity of his intelligence. M. Martelly had availed himself of his services when investing some money. He thought that, if Douglas would use his influence on Marius's behalf, the latter would secure some of the clergy to his side. He called on the notary and asked for his assistance. Douglas, who appeared very much occupied, muttered an evasive reply, saying that he was overwhelmed with business and quite unable to struggle against M. de Cazalis. I did not persist," said M. Martelly to Marius. I thought I understood that your adversary had been beforehand with you there. Yet I am surprised that such an upright man as M. Douglas should have allowed his hands to be tied. I am afraid now, my poor friend, that the game is indeed up." For a whole month Marius went about Marseille seeking to win over a few influential persons. He was everywhere received coldly with railing politeness. M. Martelly was not more fortunate. The deputy had enlisted the sympathies of the whole nobility and clergy. The middle classes, the shopkeepers, were laughing in their sleeves, unwilling to move owing to their great fear of compromising themselves. As for the common people, they sang songs about M. de Cazalis and his niece, this being all they could do on Philippe Cayol's behalf. Days passed by, and the preparations for the trial went on apace. Marius was still as much alone as on the first day, in preparing his brother's defence against the uncle's hatred and the niece's obedient falsehoods. There was only Fine, whose angry speeches merely won over the work girl's warm sympathy to Philippe's cause. One morning Marius learnt that the act of accusation against his brother and the gardener Hayes had been drawn up, the former being accused of abduction, and the latter with being an accomplice in the crime. Madame Cayol had been released for want of proof. Marius hurried off to embrace his mother. The poor woman had suffered greatly during her incarceration. Her feeble health was seriously compromised. A few days after leaving the prison, she gently expired in her son's arms, and he, sobbing, vowed to avenge her death. The funeral was the occasion for a popular demonstration. Philippe's mother was conveyed to the St. Charles cemetery, followed by a long procession of women of the people who did not hesitate to revile M. de Cazalis openly. They were even strongly inclined, after the funeral, to go and throw stones at the windows of the deputy's house. Alone in his little lodging in the Rue Sainte, Marius, when all was over, felt himself deserted in the world, and wept bitterly. His tears relieved him, he saw the road he had to follow traced out clearly before him. The misfortunes which were overwhelming him increased in his breast the love of truth and hatred of injustice. He felt that all his life must henceforth be devoted to a holy cause. He could no longer act at Marseille, the scene of the drama having changed. Future events would be occurring at Aix, where the trial was to be held. He desired to be on the spot in order to follow the different phases of the affair, and take advantage of any incidents which might arise. He asked his employer for a month's leave of absence, which the latter immediately granted. The day of his departure, he found Fine waiting at the coach office. I am going to Aix with you," she said quietly. But that would be madness," he exclaimed. You cannot afford to give your time thus. Who will attend to your flowers during your absence?" Oh, one of my friends, a girl who lives on the same floor as I do at the house on the Place aux Oeufs. I said to myself, I can be useful to them. So I put on my best dress, and here I am." I thank you very much," Marius replied simply, in an agitated voice. Chapters 7 and 8. Part 1, Chapters 9 and 10 of the Mysteries of Marseilles by Émile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Monsieur de Girousse lets his tongue wag. On arriving at Aix, Marius went to Isnard's in the Rue d'Italie. The draper had not been molested. No doubt such an insignificant prey was not considered worth capturing. Fine went straight to the jailer of the prison, whose niece she was by marriage. She had her plan, and brought with her an enormous bunch of roses, which was well received. Her pretty smiles, her caressing liveliness, made her in a couple of hours her uncle's spoilt child. He was a widower with 2 young daughters, to whom Fine had once played the part of mother. The trial was not to take place till early in the following week. Marius, his hands tied, no longer daring to attempt anything, awaited the proceedings with anguish. At times he was still mad enough to hope and to believe in an acquittal. Walking one evening on the Cours, he met M. de Girousse, who had come from Lambesc to be present at the affair. The old nobleman took his arm, and without saying a word led him to his house. "There," he said, after closing the door of a large drawing-room, "now we are alone, my friend, I can come down from my pedestal as much as I please." Marius smiled at the Count's rough and eccentric ways. "Well," the latter went on, "you don't ask me to help you, to defend you against Cazalis? Come, you're sensible. You understand that I can do nothing against that vain and obstinate nobility to which I belong. Ah, your brother has done a fine thing." Monsieur de Girousse was striding about the drawing-room. He pulled himself up abruptly before Marius, and said to him in a loud voice, "Listen to what I am about to tell you. There are some 50 of us in this good town, all old fellows like myself, living by ourselves, buried in a past forever dead. We profess to be the cream of Provence, and there we stick, doing nothing but twirling our thumbs. For, see you, we are noblemen, chivalrous hearts, awaiting devoutly the return of their legitimate princes. And the deuce take it, we shall wait a long time, so long that we shall have died of solitude and idleness before the least legitimate prince shows himself. If we were gifted with good eyes, we should observe the march of events. We cry out to facts. You shall go no farther, and yet the facts pass quietly over our bodies and crush us. It maddens me to see how we are shut up in an obstinacy as ridiculous as it is heroic. To think that we are most of us wealthy, that we might nearly all become intelligent manufacturers, working for the prosperity of the country, and that we prefer to grow mouldy in the recesses of our mansions, like the rubbish of a bygone age." He stopped to take breath, and then went on, still more energetically, "And we take a pride in our empty existence. We don't work because we disdain labor. We have a holy horror of the people because their hands are soiled. Ah, your brother dared to touch one of our daughters. We'll show him whether his blood is the same as ours. We shall league ourselves together and give the rascallions a lesson. We'll cure them of seeking to find favor in our children's eyes. Some powerful ecclesiastics will second us. They are fatally bound to our cause. It will be a splendid campaign for our vanity." After a pause, Monsieur de Girousse resumed sarcastically, "Our vanity! It has at times received some nasty knocks. A few years prior to my birth, a terrible tragedy was enacted in the mansion adjoining this. Monsieur d'Entrecasteaux, the President of the Parliament, murdered his wife in her bed. He cut her throat with a razor, which was not found till 25 days afterwards at the bottom of the garden. The victim's jewels were discovered down the well, where the murderer had thrown them to lead the authorities to believe that robbery was the reason of the murder. President d'Entrecasteaux took flight and went, I believe, to Portugal, where he died in poverty. The Parliament condemned him, in default, to be broken alive on the wheel. So you see we have also our scoundrels, and that the lower classes have nothing to envy us. That cowardly crime, committed by one of ourselves, dealt a sad blow in those days to our authority. A novelist might write a heart-rending book with the materials furnished by this doleful and tragic story." Resuming his walk, Monsieur de Girousse continued, "And we also know how to humble ourselves. For instance, when Fouché, the regicide, then Duke of Otranto, was, somewhere about 1810, exiled for a short time to our town, all the nobles dragged themselves before him. I remember an anecdote which will show you to what abject servility we lowered ourselves. On New Year's Day, 1811,
there was a long file of persons waiting to pay their respects to the ex-member of the Convention. In the reception room there was some talk of the severity of the weather, and one of the callers was expressing his fears as to the fate of the olive trees. "What do we care for the olive trees?" exclaimed one of the noble personages, "providing his Grace the Duke keeps well." "That's how we are nowadays, my friend, humble with the mighty, haughty with the weak. There are no doubt some exceptions, but they are rare. You must see, therefore, that your brother will be convicted. Our pride, which bent the knee before a Fouché, cannot do so before a Cayol. That's logical. Good night." And the Count abruptly dismissed Marius. His own words had exasperated him, and he feared that his anger might end by making him say something foolish. The next day the young man met him again, and Monsieur de Girousse took him home as on the previous evening. He held in his hand a newspaper containing a list of the jury who were to decide Philippe's case, and struck the paper forcibly with his finger, exclaiming, "Those are the men who will condemn your brother. Shall I tell you some stories about them? They are curious and instructive." Monsieur de Girousse seated himself and glanced through the paper, shrugging his shoulders as he did so. "It's a packed jury," he said at last, "an assembly of rich men who have every interest to serve the cause of Monsieur de Cazalis. They are all more or less mixed up with the clergy or on intimate terms with the nobility. They are almost all friends of men who spend their mornings in the churches and cheat their customers the rest of the day." Then he named them one by one, and spoke of the set they frequented with increasing indignation. "Humbert," he said, "is the brother of a Marseilles merchant, a dealer in oil, an honest man who holds his head erect and whom every poor devil salutes. 20 years ago their father was but a struggling clerk. To-day his sons are millionaires, thanks to his skilful speculations. One year he sold a large quantity of oil beforehand at the market rate. A few weeks afterwards the cold destroyed the olive trees, the crop was lost, and he was a ruined man if he did not deceive his customers. But he preferred deceit to poverty. Whilst his brother merchants were delivering the genuine article at a loss, our man bought up all the spoiled and rancid oils he could find, and then made the promised deliveries. His customers complained and grew angry, but the speculator coolly replied that he was strictly keeping to his agreements and that they could claim nothing further of him. And the trick was played. All Marseilles, which knows the story, is never tired of taking its hat off to this skilful man. Gautier is another Marseilles merchant. He has a nephew, Paul Bertrand, who swindled in style. This Bertrand was in partnership with a person named Aubert, living in New York, who used to send him consignments of goods to be disposed of in Marseilles. They shared the profits. Our man made immense sums in this business, the more especially as he was careful to cheat his partner at each division of profits. One day a crisis broke out and losses were incurred. Bertrand continued to receive the goods which the ship still brought, but he refused to honor the drafts Aubert drew upon him, saying that business was bad and he was in difficulties. The returned bills come back again with enormous expenses attached to them. Then Bertrand calmly says that he won't pay, that he is not obliged to be Aubert's partner forever, and that he owes nothing. There's a fresh return of the bills, fresh expenses incurred, and the New York merchant, surprised and indignant, has to take them up at great loss. The latter, who had to plead through a power of attorney, lost the action for damages he brought against Bertrand. I was assured that 2/3 of his fortune, 1,200,000 francs, were swallowed up in this catastrophe. Bertrand remains the most honest man in the world. He is received everywhere, and belongs to several congregations. He is envied and honored. Dutailler is a dealer in corn. Some time ago, one of his sons-in-law, Georges Fouque, met with a misadventure which caused a scandal that his friends hastened to hush up. Fouque always arranged matters so that it should appear that the cargoes the ships brought him had suffered in transport. The insurance offices paid on the report of an expert. But, tired of continually paying, the offices appointed an expert, an honest baker, who soon received a visit from Fouque. The latter, whilst conversing on indifferent matters, slipped a few gold pieces into his hand. The baker dropped the coins and kicked them into the middle of the room. There were several persons present, yet Fouque's reputation has in no way suffered. Delorme lives in a town not far from Marseille. He retired from business long ago. Listen to the disgraceful action his cousin Mille was guilty of. 30 years back, Mille's mother kept a draper's shop. When the old lady retired, she sold her stock and goodwill to one of her assistants, an active and intelligent young fellow whom she almost looked upon as a son. This person, whose name was Michel, quickly discharged the debt and so increased his business that he felt compelled to take a partner. He chose a young fellow of Marseille named Jean Martin, who had a little money and who appeared to be an honest, hard-working man. It was an assured fortune that Michel offered to his partner. At first, everything went well. The profits increased annually, and each partner put by a good round sum at the end of the year. But Jean Martin, who was eager for gain and dreamed of a rapid fortune, ended by reflecting that he would make twice as much if he were alone. The matter was a difficult one. Michel was in fact his benefactor, and moreover he had a friend in the landlord of the house, Madame Mille's son. If the latter were honest, Jean Martin would be unable to put his nefarious scheme into execution. He went to see him, and found him to be the scoundrel he required. He proposed to him to give him a new lease in consideration of a large sum of money. He doubled and even trebled the amount. Mille, who is both a rogue and a miser, sold himself for as much as possible. The bargain was struck. Then Jean Martin played the hypocrite with Michel. He said he desired to cancel the partnership deed and to start a business elsewhere. He even named a place he had taken. Michel, surprised but not suspecting the infamous trick of which he was to be the victim, said he could retire if he liked, and the deed was cancelled. Shortly afterwards, Michel's lease expired, and Jean Martin, armed with the new lease, triumphantly turned his ex-partner out. Michel, nearly driven mad by such a piece of treachery, opened a business elsewhere. But having no customers, he lost the money so painfully amassed during 30 years of labor. He died paralyzed, suffering atrociously, shouting that Mille and Martin were scoundrels and traitors, and calling on his sons to avenge him. Today his sons are toiling and moiling to keep body and soul together. Mille is connected by marriage with the best families in the town, his children are wealthy, and living handsomely in an odor of piety and possessing the esteem of all. There's Fèvre. His mother was married twice, her second husband being a man named Chabran, a ship-owner and bill discounter. Pretending he had made some unfortunate speculations, Chabran wrote one day to his numerous creditors to the effect that he was obliged to suspend payment. Some of them consented to give him time, but the majority decided to proceed against him. So Chabran engages 2 young fellows as clerks, and spends a week in coaching them up in the parts he wishes them to play. Then, accompanied by these youngsters, now thoroughly trained, he calls on all his creditors, one after the other, bewailing his sad position and imploring their pity for his 2 starving sons who haven't a coat to their backs. The trick succeeds admirably well. All the creditors forego their claims. The next day Chabran was at the Bourse, more sedate and more insolent than ever. A broker, who had not heard of the affair, asked him to discount 3 bills accepted, as it so happened, by 3 of the very merchants who had treated him so generously the day before. "I can have nothing to do with those kind of people," he replied haughtily. At the present time Chabran has almost retired from business. He lives in a villa where he gives sumptuous dinners on Sundays. As for Jérôme, the president of the club where he spends his evenings, is a usurer of the very worst description. It is said that he has earned at the trade a snug little million, which enabled him to marry his daughter to one of the princes of finance. His name is Bertigny. But, since his last failure, which left him a capital of 300,000 francs sticking to his fingers, he goes by the name of Félix. This skilful rascal failed a first time 40 years ago, and that enabled him to purchase a house. His creditors received 15%. 10 years later, a second failure procured him a little place in the country. That time his creditors received 10%. Scarcely 15 years ago he failed a third time, on that occasion for 300,000 francs, and offered a composition of 5%. The creditors having declined to accept it, he proved to them that all the property was really his wife's, and he never paid them a centime.
Marius, thoroughly sickened, made a movement of disgust, as though to stop these abominable stories.
You don't believe me, perhaps," said the terrible Count. You're a simpleton, my friend. I've not yet done, and you must hear me to the end."
Monsieur de Girousse railed in a dreadful manner. His loud, hissing words fell like the lash of a whip upon the persons whose disreputable histories he was relating. He named the jurymen one after another, he searched their lives and the lives of their relations, and laid bare all the scandals and meannesses connected with them. There was scarcely one he spared. Then he placed himself vehemently before Marius, and continued bitterly:
"Were you so simple as to believe that all these millionaires, all these upstarts, all these powerful persons who domineer over you and crush you today, were little saints, worthy individuals, whose lives were spotless? At Marseilles especially, these men display their vanity and insolence. They have become devotees and hypocrites. They have deceived even the worthy people who salute and esteem them. In a word, they form an aristocracy of their own. Their past is forgotten, their wealth and newly acquired probity are alone seen. Well, I'll unmask them. Listen, this one made his fortune by betraying his friend, that other by trafficking in human flesh, that other in selling his wife and daughter, that other in speculating on the misery of his creditors, that other in buying back for a song the shares of a company of which he was manager and which he had brought into disrepute, that other by scuttling a ship loaded with stones instead of merchandise and securing a handsome sum from the underwriters, that other verbally a partner by refusing to pay his share of the losses in an unfortunate speculation, that other by concealing his assets, failing 2 or 3 times, and ultimately living like an honest man, that other by selling as wine a decoction of logwood or bullock's blood, that other by buying up all the corn at a time of scarcity, that other by defrauding the customs on a large scale, attempting to corrupt the officers and robbing to his heart's content, that other by forging the signatures of friends or relations to bills which they do not dare to dishonor at maturity, but prefer to pay rather than disgrace the forger, that other by setting fire to his factory or ships previously insured far above their value, that other by tearing up and burning his acceptances snatched from his creditors' hand the day they fell due, that other by speculating at the Bourse without any intention of paying his differences, which does not prevent him enriching himself a week afterwards at the expense of some dupe."
Monsieur de Girousse stopped for want of breath. He remained silent for some time, giving his anger an opportunity of dying out. Then he again opened his lips, and smiled less bitterly.
"I am a bit of a misanthrope," he said gently to Marius, who had listened to him with pain and surprise. "I see the dark side of everything. The fact is, the idleness to which my title condemns me has enabled me to study the ignominies of this country. But I must tell you there are some honest folk among us. Unfortunately, they either dread or disdain the rascals."
Marius took his leave of Monsieur de Girousse, quite upset by the ardent words he had been listening to. He foresaw that his brother would be unmercifully condemned. The trial was to begin on the morrow. CHAPTER X. A scandalous trial. All Aix was in a flutter. Scandal acquires additional force in quiet little towns, where the curiosity of the gossips has not frequently some fresh material to feed upon. All the talk was of Philippe and Blanche. The lovers' adventures were related at every street corner. It was openly said that the accused was condemned beforehand, that Monsieur de Cazalis had, either personally or through his friends, secured a promise of conviction from each juryman. The ex-clergy gave the deputy its assistance, though in a rather lukewarm manner, it is true. It comprised in those days some men who were unwilling to be parties to an act of injustice.
A few priests, however, submitted to the influence of the religious club of Marseilles, of which Abbe Donadei was, so to say, the leader. These attempted in various ways to tie the hands of the magistracy. They succeeded especially in persuading the jurymen of the righteousness of Monsieur de Cazalis' cause. The nobles rendered them powerful aid in their task. They considered that their honor demanded they should crush Philippe Cayol. They regarded him as a personal enemy, who, having dared to attack the dignity of one of themselves, had by so doing insulted the whole body of them. To see these counts and marquises bestir themselves, give vent to their anger, and band themselves together, one might have fancied that some hostile army was at the gates of the town. Yet it was, after all, simply a question of securing the conviction of a poor wretch guilty of love and ambition. Philippe, however, had some friends and defenders. All the lower classes declared themselves freely for him. They blamed his conduct, and reproved the means he had employed, saying that he would have done better to have loved and married a young woman in his own class of life. But, whilst censuring his behavior, they loudly took his part against the deputy's pride and hatred. It was known throughout the town that Blanche, when before the examining magistrate, had denied her love; and the daughters of the people, true Provençal women, enthusiastic and courageous, spoke of her with insulting contempt. They called her a renegade, ascribed the most shameful motives to her conduct, and did not hesitate to cry their opinions from the housetops in the expressive language of the gutter. All this clamor compromised Philip's cause considerably. The whole town was in the secret of the drama about to be performed. Those whose interest it was to secure the prisoner's conviction, being certain of succeeding, did not even take the trouble to hide their proceedings. Those who would have liked to have saved him, conscious of their weakness and unarmed condition, relieved themselves by bawling, delighted to annoy those powerful persons whom they had no hope of mastering. Monsieur de Cazalis had shamelessly dragged his niece with him to Aix. During the first days he took a sort of proud delight in walking her up and down the Cour. It was his way of protesting against the idea of dishonor with which the crowd coupled the young girl's flight. He seemed to be proclaiming to the world at large, "You see that a lout cannot damage the honor of a Cazalis. My niece still looks down upon you from the height of her rank and fortune." But he was unable to continue these walks long. His behavior angered the mob, who insulted Blanche and was on the point of stoning her and her uncle. The women especially were furious. They did not perceive that it was not the niece's fault, and that she was simply submitting to an iron will. She trembled before the popular wrath, and lowered her eyes in order not to see those women gazing at her with such fiery glances. She could feel their contemptuous gesticulations behind her, hear horrible words she failed to understand, and her legs were giving way beneath her as she clung to her uncle's arm in order not to fall. She returned home one day, pale and trembling, and declared she would not go out again. The poor child was going to become a mother. At last the day of the trial arrived. The doors of the court house were besieged from early morning, the Place des Prêcheurs was filled with a noisy gesticulating crowd, clamoring as to the probable result of the trial, and discussing Philippe's guilt, and Monsieur de Cazalis's, and Blanche's attitude. The court room slowly filled. Extra rows of seats had been added for the persons provided with tickets. There were so many of them that the majority had to remain standing. There were the flower of the nobility, the leading barristers, the high functionaries, in fact all the nobilities of Aix. No prisoner had ever before had such an audience. When the doors were opened for the admission of the general public, only a few persons were able to find room. The remainder were compelled to wait in the passages and even on the steps of the building. And now and again the crowd indulged in groaning and hooting, and the noise penetrated and swelled in the court room and disturbed its quiet majesty. The ladies had taken possession of the gallery, and there formed a compact mass of smiling and anxious faces. Those in the front row fanned themselves, or leant forward with their gloved hands resting on the red velvet covering the rail of the balustrade. Further back, in the shadow, rose serried tiers of pink faces, their bodies scarcely discernible amid the mass of laces, ribbons, and stuffs. And silvery laughter, whispered words, shrill little cries, fell from this rosy, gossiping crowd. The ladies fancied themselves at a theatre. When Philippe Cayol was brought in, there ensued a great silence. The ladies devoured him with their eyes. Some even examined him from top to toe with their opera glasses. The big fellow with his energetic features was quite a success. The women, having come to judge of Blanche's taste, no doubt considered the young person less to blame, when they beheld her lover's lofty stature and clear penetrating eyes. Philippe's attitude was calm and dignified. He was dressed entirely in black, and seemed to ignore the presence of the two gendarmes beside him, rising up and reseating himself with all the grace of a man of the world. Now and again he calmly surveyed the crowd, without the least effrontery. He gazed several times up at the gallery, and on each occasion he smiled in spite of himself, so great was his wish to love and please even there. The indictment was read, and was overwhelming for the accused. In the depositions of Monsieur de Cazalis and his niece, the incidents were distorted in a skilful and terrible manner. It was stated that Philippe had perverted Blanche's mind by the aid of bad books, the truth being that he had lent her 2 utterly puerile books by Madame de Genlis. The indictment further said, on the strength of Blanche's version of the story, that she had been carried away by force, that she had clung to an almond tree, and that during the flight the abductor had resorted to violence to oblige his victim to follow him. The gravest allegation was founded on one of Blanche's depositions. She pretended she had never written Philippe any letters, and that the 2 produced by him were antedated ones, which he had made her write at Lambesc by way of precaution. When the reading of the indictment was finished, the place became filled with the noisy murmur of innumerable private conversations. Each spectator, before coming to the court house, had his own version, and now was discussing in a low voice the official one. Outside, the mob was howling. The presiding judge threatened to have the hall cleared, and silence was gradually restored. Philippe's examination was then proceeded with. When the presiding judge had asked the usual preliminary questions, and had repeated to him the particulars of the indictment drawn up against him, the young man, without refuting them, exclaimed in a clear voice, "I am accused of having been carried off by a young girl." These words caused a general laugh. The ladies hid themselves behind their fans to give full vent to their feelings. Philippe's words, foolish and absurd as they seemed, contained nevertheless a great deal of truth. The presiding judge sensibly observed that no one had ever known a man of 30 to be carried off by a girl of 16, to which Philippe quietly replied, "Neither has anyone ever seen a girl of 16 wandering along the highways, passing through towns, meeting hundreds of people, without appealing to the first person she encountered to deliver her from her abductor, her jailer." And he endeavored to show the material impossibility of the acts of violence and intimidation of which he was accused. At every hour of the day, Blanche had been free to leave him, to procure aid and succor. If she had accompanied him, it was because she loved him and had consented to the flight. In addition to this, Philippe expressed the greatest affection for the young girl, and the greatest deference for Monsieur de Cazalis. He admitted his errors, and merely asked not to be branded as an infamous abductor. The trial was adjourned to the morrow for the hearing of the witnesses. That night the town was in an uproar. The ladies spoke of Philippe with affected indignation, serious men referred to him more or less severely, while the lower classes energetically took his part. On the morrow, the crowd outside the court house was, if anything, larger and noisier than on the previous day. The witnesses were nearly all for the prosecution. M. de Girousse had not been summoned; his rough frankness was dreaded; and, moreover, he should rather have been arrested as an accomplice. Marius had begged him not to compromise himself in the affair. He also feared the old Count's violence, which might spoil everything. There was scarcely more than the evidence of one witness in Philippe's favor, that of the innkeeper at Lambesc, who declared that Blanche was accompanying her lover of her own free will. This evidence was, however, effaced, so to say, by the depositions of the other witnesses. Marguerite, the milkwoman, stammered and said she no longer remembered having brought the accused any letters from Mademoiselle de Cazalis. It was thus that each witness served the deputy's interest, either through fear or stupidity and loss of memory. The pleadings commenced, and went into the third day. Philippe's counsel defended him with dignified simplicity. He did not seek to excuse what was reprehensible in his conduct. He described him as being an ardent, ambitious man led astray by dreams of love and wealth.
but at the same time he showed that the accused could not be convicted of abduction, and that the affair itself negatived all idea of violence and intimidation. The Crown Attorney's speech was most vindictive. It was expected that it would have been milder, and his energetic accusations produced a disastrous effect. The jury brought in a verdict of guilty, and Philippe Cayol was condemned to 5 years' imprisonment, and to be exhibited in the pillory on one of the public squares of Marseille. The gardener Ayes was only condemned to a few months' imprisonment. The sentences were received with murmurs in the court-room, whilst outside the crowd howled with rage. End of chapters 9 and 10. Part 1, chapters 11 and 12 of the Mysteries of Marseilles by Émile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. How Blanche and Fine find themselves face to face. When sentence was passed on Philippe, Blanche was present, hidden at the back of the gallery. She was there by order of her uncle, who had wished to completely stamp out her affection by showing her her lover standing between 2 gendarmes like a thief. An elderly lady relative had consented to accompany her to this edifying scene. As the 2 ladies were awaiting their carriage on the steps of the court-house, the crowd, pushing forward, suddenly separated them. Blanche, who was dragged to the centre of the Place des Prêcheurs, was recognized by the market women, who began hooting and insulting her. "That's her! That's her!" shouted the women. "The renegade! The renegade!" The poor bewildered child, not knowing where to fly to, was half dead with shame and fright, when a young girl energetically divided the howling mob that surrounded her and placed herself at her side. It was Fine. The flower girl had also been to hear sentence passed on Philippe. For the space of nearly 3 hours she had passed through all the anguish of hope and fear. The Crown Attorney's speech had been crushing, and on hearing the judgment she had begun to weep. She had just quitted the court-house, irritated and in a terrible state of excitement, when the hooting of the market women reached her. She understood that Blanche was there, and that she would be able to avenge herself by abusing her. She dashed forward with clenched fists, and an insult ready on her lip. According to her, the young girl was the great culprit. She had lied. She had been guilty of perjury and cowardice. At this thought all Fine's plebeian blood rushed to her face and urged her on to shout and strike. She rushed forward and separated the crowd to take her share of vengeance. But, when she was face to face with Blanche, when she saw her doubled in 2 by fright, she had pity for the weak and trembling child. She found her so small, so captivating, so delicately fragile, that a generous thought of pardon came from her heart. She violently pushed back the women who were shaking their fists at the young lady, and, stretching herself to her full height, she exclaimed, in a loud voice, "And what now? Aren't you ashamed? She is alone, and you are 100 against her. The Almighty doesn't require your shouts to punish her. Let us pass." She had taken Blanche's hand, and stood erect before the murmuring people, who drew closer together so as not to allow the 2 young girls to get through them. Fine awaited with pale and trembling lips. And as she encouraged the little lady with a glance, she perceived that she would soon be a mother. She turned quite pale and advanced towards the women. "Let me pass," she continued with greater violence. "Do you not see the poor girl's condition, and that you will kill her child?" She thrust back an old hag who was protesting, and all the others gave way. Fine's words had suddenly made them silent and compassionate. Both girls were then able to retire. Blanche, crimson with shame, nestled in fear against her companion, and feverishly hastened her footsteps. In order to avoid the Rue du Pont Moreau, which was then swarming with people and full of noise, the flower girl took the little Rue St. John. On reaching the Cours, she conducted Mlle. de Cazalis to her residence, the door of which was open. She had not uttered a single word all the way. Blanche obliged her to enter the hall, and there, half closing the door, she said to her in an affected tone of voice, "Oh, mademoiselle, how grateful I am to you for your assistance! Those wicked women would have killed me." "Don't thank me," answered Fine sharply. "I went there like the others, to insult and beat you." "You?" "Yes, I hate you. I wish you had died in your cradle."
Blanche looked at the flower girl with astonishment. She had drawn herself up, her aristocratic instincts were getting the better of her, and her lips were curling slightly with disdain. The two young girls were facing each other, one in all her slim gracefulness, the other in all her energetic beauty. They contemplated each other in silence, feeling the rivalry of their race and heart thundering within them. " You are beautiful and wealthy," continued Fine bitterly. " Why did you come and rob me of my sweetheart, when later on you could only feel contempt and anger for him? You should have sought out some one in your own sphere. You would have found a youth as pale and cowardly as yourself who would have satisfied your little girlish feeling of love. Look here, do not take our men, or if you do we will tear your pink faces." " I do not understand," stammered Blanche, who was becoming afraid again. " You don't understand. Listen. I was in love with Philippe. He came and bought roses of me of a morning, and my heart used to beat fit to break when I handed him my nosegays. I know now where those flowers went to. One day they told me he had run away with you. I wept. Then I thought that you would love him fondly and he would be happy. And now you have had him put in prison. Look here, do not let us speak of that, or I shall get angry and beat you." She stopped palpitating, then continued, approaching nearer to Blanche and burning her icy cold cheeks with her hot breath. " You don't know, then, how we love, we poor girls. We love with all our body, with all our courage. When we run away with a man, we don't say afterwards that he took advantage of our weakness. We clasp him in our arms with all our might to defend him. Ah, if Philippe had loved me! But I am an unhappy girl, a poor creature, and ugly." And Fine began to sob and show herself as weak as Mademoiselle de Cazalis. The latter took her hand, and in a voice broken with tears, answered, " For pity's sake, do not accuse me. Will you be my friend? Shall I lay my heart bare to you? I suffer so much. If you only knew, I can do nothing. I obey my uncle, who subdues me in his grip of iron. I am a coward, I know it, but I have not the strength to be otherwise. And I love Philippe, the memory of him is always within me. He told me it would be, that my punishment, if I ever betrayed him, would be to love him eternally, to keep him without end in my breast. He is there, he is burning me, he will kill me. A short time ago, when they sentenced him, I felt something within me that made me start, and which tore my inside. I weep. Look, I ask your pardon." All Fine's anger had gone. She was supporting Blanche, who was staggering. " You are right," continued the poor child. " I do not deserve pity. I have dealt a blow at the one I love, and who will never love me more. Ah, for mercy's sake, if he one day become your husband, speak to him of my tears, ask him to forgive me. What drives me mad is that I cannot tell him I worship him. He would laugh. He would not understand all my cowardice. No, do not speak to him of me. Let him forget me. I shall be alone to weep." There was a painful silence. " And your child? " asked Fine. " My child," said Blanche, bewildered. " I don't know. My uncle would take it away from me. Shall I act as a mother to it?" The flower girl uttered these words in a tender and grave voice. Mademoiselle clasped her in her arms in a passionate embrace. " Oh, you are so good," she said. " You know how to love. Try to see me at Marseilles when the hour arrives. I will trust in you." At this moment the elderly relative returned, after having sought in vain for Blanche in the crowd. Fine promptly withdrew and reascended the Cours. As she reached the Place de Carmelite, she perceived Marius from afar conversing with Philippe's lawyer. The young man was in despair. He would never have believed that they could pass such a severe sentence on his brother. The 5 years' imprisonment terrified him, but he was perhaps still more painfully overcome at the thought of the public exhibition on a square at Marseilles. He recognized the Deputy's hand in this punishment. M. de Cazalis had above all wished to deprive Philippe of the power of pleasing, to render him forever unworthy of woman's love. The crowd surrounding Marius were clamoring about injustice, the public with one voice protesting against the enormity of the punishment, and while the young man was engaged in a heated discussion with the lawyer, losing his temper and showing symptoms of despair, he felt a soft hand on his arm. He turned sharply round and perceived Fine at his side, calm and smiling. " Hope, and follow me," she said to him in an undertone. " Your brother is saved." CHAPTER XII. WHICH SHOWS THAT A JAILER's HEART IS NOT ALWAYS MADE OF STONE. While Marius was running over the town before the trial to no purpose, Fine had been labouring on her side at the work of deliverance. She had engaged in a regular campaign against the conscience of her uncle, the jailer Revertégat. She had taken up her quarters with him and passed her days at the prison. She did her best from morning to night to make herself useful, to be beloved by her uncle, who lived alone like a growling bear with his 2 young daughters. She attacked him in his paternal love, she was full of charming ways with the children, and spent all her savings in toys, sweets, and small articles of dress. The little ones were not in the habit of being spoiled. They showed riotous tenderness for their big cousin, who danced them on her knees and distributed such nice, beautiful things amongst them. The father felt affected and thanked Fine effusively. He experienced the young girl's penetrating influence in spite of himself, and was ill-tempered when he had to leave her. She seemed to have brought the sweet perfume of her roses and violets with her. The lodge smelt nice since she was there, merry and light of foot. Her bright petticoats appeared to bring light air and gaiety. All was smiling, now, in the dark room, and Revertégat remarked, with a broad grin, that spring had taken up its abode with him. The worthy man forgot himself in the caressing effluvia of this spring. His heart softened, and he lost the harshness and severity of his calling. Fine was too smart a girl not to play her part with fondling prudence. She did not hasten events, she brought the jailer little by little to feelings of compassion and kindness. Then she pitied Philippe before him, and obliged him to acknowledge that they were detaining him unjustly in prison. When she held her uncle in her power, off his guard and disposed to be obedient to her wishes, she asked him if she could not visit the poor young man's cell. He dared not say no, but conducted her there, allowed her to enter, and remained watching at the door. Fine stood before Philippe like a silly thing. She gazed at him, confused and blushing, forgetting what she wanted to say to him. The young man recognized her, and hastened towards her with a movement full of tenderness and delight. " You here, my dear child? " he exclaimed. " Ah, how kind of you to come to see me! Will you allow me to kiss your hand?" Philippe assuredly imagined himself in his little apartment in the Rue Sainte, and he was not perhaps far from dreaming of a fresh adventure. The flower girl, surprised, almost wounded, withdrew her hand, and gravely contemplated Blanche's lover. " You must be mad, Monsieur Philippe," she answered. " You know very well that you are married now, for me. Let us speak of serious things." She lowered her voice and continued rapidly. " The jailer is my uncle, and I have been working at your deliverance for the past week. I wanted to see you to tell you that your friends have not forgotten you. So hope." Philippe, on hearing this good news, regretted his amorous welcome. " Give me your hand," he said in an unsteady voice. " It is a friend who asks you for it, to clasp it as an old comrade. Do you forgive me?" The flower girl smiled without answering. " I think," she resumed, " that I shall soon be able to throw the gate wide open to you. On what day would you like to run away?" "Run away? But I shall be acquitted. What is the use of running away? If I were to escape, I should be acknowledging my guilt." Fine had not thought of this reasoning. To her mind, Philippe was condemned beforehand. But as a matter of fact, he was right, he must await the judgment. As she preserved silence, pensive and irresolute, Revertégat gave 2 gentle knocks at the door to beg her to leave the cell. " Well," she resumed, addressing the prisoner, " be ready all the same. If you are condemned, we will prepare your flight, your brother and me. Have faith." She withdrew, leaving Philippe almost in love. She had now time before her to win over her uncle. She continued the same tactics, bewitching the worthy man with her goodness of heart and gracefulness, and exciting his pity on his prisoner's lot. In the end she even drew her 2 little cousins into the conspiracy, and they at a word would have left their father to follow her. One evening, after having softened Revertégat's heart by all the cajoling she was capable of, she ended by boldly asking him for Philippe's liberty. Of course," exclaimed the jailer. "If it only depended on me, I would open the door to him immediately." "But it does only depend on you, uncle," Fine innocently answered. "Ah, so you think! But the next morning they would turn me adrift and send me starving with my 2 daughters." These words made the flower girl look quite serious. "But," she resumed after a moment, "if I gave you money — supposing I loved this youth — supposing I were to implore you with joined hands to give him back to me?" "You! You!" exclaimed the astonished jailer. He had risen, he gazed at his niece to see if she were not laughing at him. When he observed her grave and troubled manner, he bent forward, vanquished, softened, consenting by a sign. "Faith," he added, "I'll do what you like. You are too good and pretty a girl for me to refuse." Fine kissed him and spoke of something else. Henceforward she was sure of victory. On several occasions she returned to the conversation, accustoming Robertet to the idea that he would allow Philippe to escape. She did not wish to throw her relative into poverty, and she offered him a first reward of 15,000 francs. This offer dazzled the jailer, who from that moment belonged to her body and soul. And that is how Fine had been able to say to Marius with her clever smile, "Follow me, your brother is saved." She accompanied the young man to the prison. On the road she related to him all she had been doing, how she had little by little won over her uncle. Marius's straightforward nature set him first of all against the plan. Then he remembered the intrigues to which M. de Cazalis had recourse, and reflected that, after all, he was only making use of the same weapons as his adversaries, and his mind was at ease. He thanked Fine most touchingly, and was at a loss to know what proof to give her of his gratitude. The young girl, happy beyond measure, hardly listened to his protestations of devotedness. They could only see Robertet in the evening. The jailer, from the very first words of the conversation, pointed out his 2 little girls who were playing in a corner of the lodge, and simply said to Marius, "Monsieur, they are my excuse. I would not ask a sou if I had not these children to feed." This was a painful scene for Marius. He abridged it as much as possible. He was aware that the jailer was giving way both to self-sacrifice and interest, and if he could not despise him, he none the less felt ill at ease at concluding such a bargain with him. All was settled in a few minutes. Marius announced that he would leave the following morning for Marseilles, and would bring back with him the 15,000 francs promised by Fine. He would get them from his banker. His mother had left a sum of 50,000 francs, which was deposited with M. Bérard, whose house was one of the most important and best known of the city. The flower girl was to remain at X and there await the young man's return. He set out full of hope, with the idea that his brother was already free, but as he stepped out of the diligence at Marseilles, he learned a terrible piece of news, which completely staggered him. The banker Bérard had just been made a bankrupt. End of chapters 11 and 12. Part 1, chapters 13 and 14 of the Mysteries of Marseilles by Émile Zola. Translated by Ernest, Alfred, Vizetelly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. A bankruptcy, as there are many. Marius hastened to the banker Bérard. He could not believe the bad news. He possessed all the confidence of a straightforward mind. On the road he said to himself that the rumors that were afloat were perhaps, after all, only calumnies, and so he clung to false hopes. The loss of his fortune at this moment amounted to his brother's discomfiture. It seemed to him that chance would not be so cruel. The public must be mistaken. Bérard would hand him his money. When he entered the banking house he was seized with a pang of anguish. He saw the terrible reality. The offices were empty, and these spacious rooms, deserted and calm, with their closed wire-work cages, appeared to him funeral-like. It is difficult to conceive what mournful desolation a fortune that is breaking up leaves behind it. From the counting-house, ledgers, papers, escaped a vague odor of ruin. Seals were to be seen everywhere, with their white bands and large blotches of red wax. Marius crossed 3 rooms without meeting anyone. He at length discovered a clerk who had come to remove a few objects belonging to him from a desk, and who answered him sharply that Monsieur Bérard was in his office. The young man entered all of a tremble, forgetting to close the door. He perceived the banker quietly at work, writing letters, setting papers in order, and balancing accounts. He was young, tall, had a handsome and intelligent face, was dressed with great care, wore rings on his fingers, and presented the appearance of a gallant and wealthy man. One would have said he had just had a brush up to receive his customers and explain his disaster to them himself. Moreover, his attitude appeared courageous. This man was either a victim of circumstances, full of resignation, or else an arrant rascal brazening out his infamy. On seeing Marius enter, he looked him in the face, and his countenance wore an expression of sad straightforwardness. " I was awaiting you, dear sir," he said in an unsteady voice. " You see, I am waiting for all those whose ruin I have brought about. I shall have courage to the end. I want each of them to assure himself that I have no cause to be ashamed." He took up a register from his writing table, and opened it with some affectation. " Here are my accounts," he continued. " My liabilities are 1,000,000, my assets 1,500,000 francs. The court will adjudicate, and I believe my creditors will lose nothing. I am the first to suffer. I have lost my fortune and credit. I have allowed insolvent debtors to rob me in a most barefaced way." Marius had not yet uttered a word. In face of Bérard's broken down serenity, in presence of this display of austere grief, he could not find a single reproach, not one word of indignation. He almost pitied this man who was heading the storm. " Sir," he said to him at last, " why did you not warn me when you saw your affairs getting into a mess and turning to the bad? My mother was a friend of your mother's. In remembrance of our former intimacy, you should have made me withdraw this money, which you were about to compromise, from your control. Your present ruin strips me of everything, and plunges me in despair." Bérard ran forward and grasped Marius's hands. " Do not say that !" he exclaimed in a voice broken by tears. " Do not overwhelm me. Ah ! you have no idea of the regret that is tormenting me. When I saw the abyss, I sought to catch hold of the branches. I struggled till the last moment, hoping to be able to save the amounts deposited in my hands. You cannot imagine what terrible risks are run by those who deal in money." Marius had nothing to answer. What could he say to a man who found his excuse in self-accusation? He had no proofs, he did not dare call Bérard a scamp, it only remained to him to withdraw. The banker spoke in such an aggrieved tone of voice, in such a convinced and straightforward manner, that he hastened to go away and leave him to himself. He felt oppressed at his misfortune. As he was crossing the empty offices again, the clerk who had at last gathered his things together, took his bundle and hat and followed him. This clerk was muttering between his teeth. At each step he looked in a strange way at Marius, and shrugged his shoulders. Below on the pavement, he suddenly approached him. " Well," said he, " what think you of Monsieur Bérard? He's a splendid actor, isn't he? The door of his office was open, and it made me laugh to see his distressed manner. He almost wept, the honest fellow. Permit me to tell you that you have just allowed yourself to be duped in the most beautiful way." " I don't understand you," answered Marius. " So much the better. That is because you are an honest man. For my part, I have just left this shop with profound satisfaction. I long since expected a stroke of business like this. I foresaw the issue of this high comedy of theft. I possess a peculiar knack for ferreting out jobbery in a firm. Explain yourself." " Oh, the story is simple. I'll relate it to you in a few words. 10 years ago Bérard started a banking business. At the present day I have no doubt that he prepared his bankruptcy from the first moment. This was his reasoning. I wish to be rich because I have many desires, and to be so as rapidly as possible, because I am in a hurry to satisfy them. But the straight road is rough and long. I prefer to follow the paths of cheating and get my million together in 10 years. I will make myself a banker, I shall have a counting house where I will take the people's money as a bird catcher snares the feathered songsters. Each year I will pilfer a round sum. I will last as long as necessary. I will stop when my pockets are full. Then I shall quietly suspend payment. On 2 millions that will have been entrusted to me, I will generously return 200 or 300,000 francs to my creditors. The remainder, hidden away in a little corner I know of, will assist me to live as I desire, as an idler and a voluptuary. Do you understand, dear sir?" Marius had listened to the clerk with stupefaction. "But," he exclaimed at last, "what you are telling me is impossible. Bérard has just confided to me that his liabilities amount to 1 million, and his assets to 1.5 million. We shall all be paid in full." The clerk held his sides with laughter. "Ah, goodness gracious, how simple you are!" he continued. "Do you really believe in these assets of 1.5 million? First of all, they will deduct Madame Bérard's marriage portion from the amount. Now, Madame Bérard brought her husband 50,000 francs, which he, in the marriage contract, transformed into the handsome sum of 500,000 francs. That, as you see, was a little robbery of 450,000 francs. There remains 1 million, and that million is almost entirely represented by suspicious book debts. Oh, the proceeding is simple enough. There are persons at Marseilles who sell their signatures for 100 sous piece, and they live very well at this easy and lucrative business. Bérard had got men of straw to sign him numbers of acceptances, and he pocketed the money which he now pretends he lent to insolvent debtors. If they give you 10% on your claim, you may esteem yourself lucky, and you will only receive that in 18 months or 2 years, when the assignees of the bankruptcy have concluded their work." Marius was completely upset. Thus the 50,000 francs left him by his mother would be useless to him. He wanted money at once, and they talked to him of waiting 2 years. And his ruin and despair were the work of a scoundrel who had just been laughing at him. He flew into a passion. "This Bérard is a rascal," he burst out. "He will be vigorously hunted down. Society must be freed of these crafty men who enrich themselves by the ruin of others. The galleys await them." The clerk again burst out laughing. "Bérard," he continued, "will perhaps get a fortnight's imprisonment, that is all. You don't seem to understand again. Listen to me. You say the galleys await Bérard," continued the clerk. "The galleys only await clumsy folk. During the 10 years that our customer has been hatching and nursing his bankruptcy he has taken his precautions. Infamy, such as this, is quite a work of art. His accounts are in order, and he has the law on his side. He knew beforehand how slight was the risk he ran. The most the court can do will be to reproach him with heavy personal expenses. They will tax him, besides, with having put a large number of bills of exchange in circulation, which is a ruinous way of procuring money. The penalties for such mistakes are ridiculous. Bérard, as I told you, will get a fortnight, or a month's imprisonment at the most." "But," exclaimed Marius, "cannot one go and proclaim this man's crime on the public square, prove it, and have him sentenced?" "No, indeed, one cannot do that. Proofs are wanting, I tell you. Besides, Bérard has not lost his time. He has foreseen everything. He has made powerful friends at Marseilles, imagining he would some day have need of their influence. He is now a sort of inviolable personage in this city of coteries. If they touched a single hair of his head all his friends would yell with grief and rage. The most they could do would be to imprison him for form's sake. When he leaves jail he will find his little million again, he will make a show of luxury and will easily conquer fresh esteem. You will then meet him driving out in his carriage, extended on his cushions, and the wheels of his vehicle will splash you with mud. You will find him indifferent and idle, with a large establishment, enjoying all the luxuries of life. And to worthily crown this success in the art of robbery, they will bow to him, like him, and open him a new credit of honor and consideration." Marius preserved ferocious silence. The clerk made him a slight bow, and was about to leave him. "It is thus the farce is played," he added. "I had all that on my heart, and am glad to have met you to ease myself. Now a piece of advice. Keep what I have told you to yourself, say good-bye to your money, and do not bother any more about the sorry business. Reflect, and you will see I am right. Good day." Marius remained alone. He had a tremendous desire to rush upstairs to Bérard and slap him in the face. All his instincts of probity and justice had risen up within him, urging him to drag the banker out into the street and proclaim his crime. Then his passion gave way to disgust.
He remembered his poor mother shamelessly deceived by this man, and from that moment he felt nothing but crushing contempt for him. He followed the clerk's advice and left the house, endeavoring to forget that he had had money, and that a rascal had robbed him of it. What the clerk had told him was confirmed in every point. Bérard was sentenced to a month's imprisonment for simple bankruptcy. A year afterwards, with florid complexion and easy insolent bearing, he sauntered about Marseille, displaying the jovial humour of a wealthy man. He rang his purse in the clubs, restaurants, and theatres, everywhere, in fact, where pleasure could be purchased, and on his road he invariably met with complacent persons, or dupes who bowed to him lowly. Chapter 14, in which it is proved that it is possible to spend 30,000 francs a year when only earning 1,800. Marius went mechanically down to the port. He walked straight on without noticing whither he was going. He was, so to say, in a state of stupefaction. One sole thought occupied his otherwise empty brain, and kept repeating in a sing-song way that he needed 15,000 francs without a moment's loss of time. He cast about him the vague glance of persons in despair, as though he were looking on the ground to see if he could not find the money he required in the interstices of the paving stones. Down at the port he felt a longing to be rich. The merchandise piled up along the quays, the ships bringing fortunes in their holds, the noise, the motion of that money-making crowd, irritated him. Never before had he felt his poverty so strongly. For a moment he was filled with envy, revolt, and bitter jealousy. He asked himself why was he poor whilst others were rich? And still that ever-recurring thought kept ringing in his head, fit to break it. 15,000 francs! 15,000 francs! His brother was awaiting him, and he could not go back empty-handed. He had only a few hours in which to save him from infamy. But he could form no plan. His bewildered senses did not furnish him with a single practical idea. He turned about in his powerlessness, exerted every effort of his mind in vain. He struggled, almost choking with rage and anguish. He could never ask his employer, Monsieur Martelly, to lend him 15,000 francs. His earnings were too small to warrant such a loan. Moreover, he knew the ship owner's upright principles, and dreaded his reproaches if he admitted to him that he wished to purchase another's conscience. Monsieur Martelly would at once have refused the money. Marius suddenly had an idea. He would not stay to discuss it in his mind, but hurried off to his lodging in the Rue Sainte. On the same floor as himself there resided a young clerk named Charles Blétry, who was employed as a collector at the soap works of Messrs. d'Asta and Degas. A kind of intimacy had sprung up between these two young fellows, living side by side. Marius had been won over by Charles' gentleness, for the latter went regularly to church, led an exemplary life, and appeared to be of the strictest honesty. Yet, during the past 2 years, he had been spending money pretty freely. He had refurnished his lodging in a luxurious style, buying carpets, hangings, mirrors, and rich furniture. Besides this, he came home later, lived more expensively, but still remained gentle and honest, quiet and pious. At first his neighbor's outlay rather astonished Marius, who could not understand how a clerk earning 1,800 francs a year could afford to purchase such expensive things. But Charles told him that he had inherited some money, and that he intended shortly to resign his position and live on his means. He even placed himself and his purse at his disposal, but Marius declined. To-day he recalled this offer, and was about to knock at the young man's door and ask him for the means to save his brother. A loan of 15,000 francs would not perhaps inconvenience him, seeing how lavishly he was spending his money. He proposed to himself to repay the amount in installments, persuaded that his neighbor would grant him all the time necessary. The clerk, however, was not at home in the Rue Sainte, and as Marius was pressed for time he went off to Messrs. d'Asta and Degas' soap works, situated on the Boulevard des Dames. When he arrived there and asked for Charles Blétry, it seemed to him that he was eyed in a strange manner. The workman told him to address himself to Monsieur d'Asta, who was in his office. Surprised at this reception, Marius decided to do so, and found the manufacturer engaged in conversation with 3 gentlemen, who stopped talking directly he showed himself. Can you tell me, sir," inquired the young man, if Monsieur Charles Blétry is at the factory?" D'Asta exchanged a rapid glance with one of the persons present, a stout, pale, and severe-looking man.
Monsieur Charles Blétry will return presently," he replied. "Please wait for him. Are you a friend of his?" "Yes," replied Marius, simply. "He resides in the same house as I do. I have known him for about 3 years." There was a pause. The young man, thinking he was in the way, added with a bow, and walking towards the door, "I am much obliged to you. I will wait for him outside." Then the stout gentleman leant forward and said a few words to the manufacturer in a low voice. Monsieur d'Ast signed to Marius to stay. "Have the goodness to wait here," he exclaimed. "Your presence may be useful to us. You must know something of Monsieur Blétry's mode of living, and can no doubt give us some information about him." Marius, greatly astonished, and not understanding, hesitated. "Excuse me," resumed Monsieur d'Ast with great politeness. "I see that my words surprise you." And, indicating the stout man, he went on, "That gentleman is the police commissary of the district, and I have sent for him to arrest Charles Blétry, who has robbed us of 60,000 francs in 2 years." On hearing Charles accused of theft, Marius understood everything. He accounted for the young fellow's lavish expenditure, and shuddered at the thought that he had been on the point of accepting his offers of service. He would never have believed that his neighbor could have been guilty of a mean action. He knew very well that there existed at Marseilles, as in all great centres of industry, clerks who robbed their employers in order to satisfy their vices and their love of luxury. He had often heard of clerks earning 100 or 150 francs a month, and who managed to lose immense sums in gambling in the clubs, to throw gold to loose women, and to idle away their time in restaurants and cafes. But Charles seemed so pious, so modest, so honest, he had played the hypocrite so artfully, that Marius had been taken in by these appearances of probity, and he even now entertained doubts despite Monsieur d'Ast's formal accusation. He seated himself and awaited the development of the drama. As a matter of fact, he could not very well have done otherwise. During half an hour a mournful silence reigned in the office. The manufacturer was writing, whilst the police commissary and the 2 officers, mute and looking half asleep, gazed vaguely before them with terrible patience. Such a sight was calculated to make Marius honest had he been disposed to be otherwise. A step was heard outside, and the door slowly opened. "Here's our man," said Monsieur d'Ast, rising from his seat. Charles Blétry entered quite unsuspiciously, without even noticing the persons who were there. "You wish to see me, sir?" he asked, in that drawling voice peculiar to clerks when addressing their employers. As Monsieur d'Ast was looking him straight in the face, he turned round and beheld the police commissary, whom he knew by sight. He became ghastly pale, understanding that he was lost, and his whole body trembled. He had just walked into the meshes of the law with his eyes shut. Seeing that his frightened looks were accusing him, he tried to pull himself together and to recover a little coolness and audacity. "Yes, I wish to see you," Monsieur d'Ast explained violently, "and you know why, don't you? Ah, scoundrel, you'll never rob me again." "I don't know what you mean," stammered Blétry. "I've never robbed you. What is it you accuse me of?" The police commissary had seated himself at the manufacturer's desk, ready to draw up his report, whilst the 2 officers were guarding the door. "Kindly tell me, sir," said the police commissary to Monsieur d'Ast, "how you discovered that Monsieur Blétry had been guilty of embezzling your money." Then Monsieur d'Ast told the story of the crime. He noticed that occasionally his collector was an extremely long time in getting in certain moneys. But as he had unlimited confidence in the young man, he attributed these delays to the dilatoriness of his customers. The first embezzlement must have occurred quite 18 months back. Anyhow, the day before, one of his customers being on the verge of bankruptcy, he had gone personally to demand payment of an account amounting to 5,000 francs, and had thereupon learnt that Blétry had collected it some weeks previously. Much alarmed, he had hurried back to the factory, and, by going through the cashier's books, had convinced himself that about 60,000 francs were missing. The police commissary then proceeded to question Blétry. The latter, taken unawares and unable to deny the facts, concocted a ridiculous story. "One day," he said, "I lost my pocket-book containing 40,000 francs. I had not the courage to tell Monsieur d'Ast of this great misfortune, so I embezzled some money to gamble on the Stock Exchange, hoping to win and so reimburse the firm." The police commissary asked him for particulars, confused him by his questions, and forced him to contradict himself. Blétry then tried another falsehood. "You are right," he resumed, "and I did not lose the pocket-book. I prefer to tell you everything. The truth is, I was robbed myself. I gave shelter to a young man who was hard up. One night he went off with my collector's bag, and it contained a considerable sum of money." "Come, don't make your crime worse by lying," said the commissary, with that terrifying patience of police officials. "You know very well that we can't believe you. It's no use inventing such rigmaroles." He then turned to Marius, and continued, "I asked Monsieur Das to detain you, sir, thinking you might be useful to us in our inquiry. The accused is, you said, your neighbor. Do you know anything about his mode of life? Will you not beseech him with us to tell the truth?" Marius felt dreadfully embarrassed. He pitied Blétry, who was reeling like a drunken man and looking at him imploringly. The man was not a hardened scoundrel. No doubt he had given way to temptation, to a weak mind and heart. But Marius's conscience would not be stilled, and commanded him to say what he knew. He did not reply to the police commissary directly, but preferred to address himself to Blétry. "Listen, Charles," he said, "I do not know whether you are guilty. I have always found you good and quiet. I am aware that you support your mother and that you are beloved by all who know you. If you have been guilty of wrong, admit your folly. You will cause less suffering to those who love and esteem you by frankly owning your guilt and showing sincere repentance." Marius spoke in a gentle and convincing voice. Blétry, whom the curt words of the police commissary had left dumb and inwardly irritated, gave way before his friend's kindness. He thought of his mother, he thought of the esteem and the friendships he was about to lose, and his emotion nearly choked him. He burst into sobs, weeping hot tears in his closed hands, and for some minutes no sound was heard but the heart-rending cry of his despair. It was a complete avowal. The spectators of the scene remained silent. "Well, yes," Blétry exclaimed at last, amidst his tears, "I have robbed. I'm a scoundrel. I didn't know what I was about. I commenced by taking a few 100 francs, then I required 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 francs at a time. It seemed as if someone was behind me, urging me on. And my needs, my appetites were ever increasing." "But what did you do with all that money?" asked the police commissary. "I don't know. I gave it away, lost it at play, devoured it somehow. You don't know the life. I was happy enough in my poverty and troubled with nothing. I loved to go to church and to live worthily like an honest man. But then I had a taste of luxury and vice, I got to know women, I bought expensive things. I was mad." "Can you give me the names of the women with whom you squandered the money you were embezzling?" "As if I knew their names! I met them here, there, everywhere, in the streets and at public balls. They came because I had my pockets full of gold, and they went off when they were empty. Then I lost a lot playing baccarat at the clubs. What turned me into a thief was seeing certain well-born young men throwing their money out of window and revelling in wealth and idleness. I wanted to know women as they did, to have noisy joys, nights spent in gambling and debauchery. I required 30,000 francs a year, and I was only earning 1,800, so I ended by stealing." The poor wretch, suffocating, overcome by grief, dropped on to a chair. Marius went up to Monsieur Dast, who was also much affected, and beseeched him to be merciful. He then hastened to withdraw from a scene which made his heart bleed. He left Blétry quite prostrated by a kind of nervous stupor. Some months later he learnt that the young man had been condemned to 5 years' imprisonment. Once outside, Marius experienced a great feeling of relief. He understood that by assisting at Charles's arrest he had received a lesson. A few hours before, when down at the port, he had indulged in some evil ideas of fortune. He had just seen where such thoughts might lead him. And suddenly he remembered why he had gone to the soap works. He had only an hour left in which to find the 15,000 francs which were to save his brother. End of chapters 13 and 14.
Part 1, Chapters 15 and 16 of the Mysteries of Marseilles by Émile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Philippe refuses to save himself. Marius had to admit to himself how powerless he was. He knew not at what door to knock. It is not easy for a simple clerk to borrow 15,000 francs in the course of an hour. He walked slowly down the Rue X, straining his mind, but finding nothing in his wearied brain. Money troubles are terrible. One would sooner battle with an assassin than fight against the imperceptible and crushing phantom of poverty. Nobody has ever yet been able to conjure up a 5-franc piece. When the young man, hopeless and at his wits' end, reached the Cours Bezuns, he decided to return to X empty-handed. The coach was about to start, and there was only one vacant seat left, an outside one. He took it with delight, preferring to remain in the open air, for anxiety was stifling him, and he hoped that the vast horizon of the open country would calm his fever. It was a sad journey. In the morning he had passed the same trees, the same hills, and hope, which brought a smile to his lips, then shed a joyous brightness over the fields and slopes. Now, as he again beheld the same countryside, he enveloped it in all the gloom that was weighing on his mind. The heavy vehicle lumbered on, the cultivated land, the pine woods, the little hamlets succeeded each other at either side of the road, and Marius found in each change of landscape a deeper air of mourning, a more poignant grief. Night fell, and it seemed to him that the entire country was covered by an immense pall. On reaching X, he walked slowly towards the prison. He felt that he would always arrive too soon with his evil news. When he entered the jail it was 9 o'clock. Revertéga and Fine were killing time by having a game at cards on a corner of the table. The flower girl jumped up gleefully and ran to meet the young man. "Well?" she asked him, with a bright smile, and throwing back her head coquettishly. Marius had not the courage to reply. He sat down, exhausted. "Speak up!" cried Fine. "You've got the money?" "No," the young man answered simply. After a moment he told them of Bérard's failure, Blétry's arrest, all the misfortunes he had encountered at Marseilles. He wound up by saying, "I am now no more than a poverty-stricken wretch. My brother will remain a prisoner." The flower girl remained painfully surprised. Her hands clasped, in that attitude of pity peculiar to Provençal women, she repeated in a rueful tone of voice, "How sad! How sad!" She looked at her uncle, and seemed to be urging him to speak. Revertéga eyed the two young people compassionately. It was evident that a struggle was taking place within him. At length he seemed to make up his mind, and said to Marius, "Listen to me, sir. My duties have not hardened me to such an extent as to render me insensible to the sufferings of worthy people. I have already said why I was willing to sell you your brother's freedom. But I do not wish you to think that the love of money alone is prompting me. If unfortunate circumstances prevent your placing me at once out of the reach of poverty, I will nevertheless open the door to Monsieur Philippe. You can come to my assistance later on, and pay me the 15,000 francs little by little when you are able to do so." Fine clapped her hands on hearing these words. She flung her arms round her uncle's neck and embraced him heartily. Marius looked very grave as he replied, "I cannot accept your sacrifice. I am already reproaching myself with having tempted you to disregard your duty, and I refuse to increase my responsibility by also casting you adrift without a crust of bread." The flower girl turned to the young man almost angrily. "Hold your tongue!" she cried. "Monsieur Philippe must be saved. I intend that he shall be. Besides, we don't need you to open the prison doors. Come, uncle, if Monsieur Philippe is willing, his brother can have nothing to say." Marius followed the young woman and the jailer, who were going in the direction of the prisoner's cell. They had taken a dark lantern, and were gliding softly along the passages in order not to excite remark. All three entered the cell and closed the door behind them. Philippe was asleep. Revertéga, moved by his niece's tears, had softened the prison regulations as much as possible for the young man. He brought him lunch and dinner, which Fine herself prepared. He lent him books, and had even given him an additional rug. The cell had been made habitable, and Philippe was not too uncomfortable there.
He knew, moreover, that they were working for his escape. He woke up and held out his hands effusively to his brother and the flower girl. You have come for me?" he asked, smiling. Yes," answered Fine. Dress yourself at once." Marius remained silent. His heart was beating quickly. He feared that a strong desire for liberty might lead his brother to accept the means of flight which he himself had thought right to decline. So everything is agreed and arranged," resumed Philippe. I may go off without fear or regret. You have paid the promised amount." You don't answer me, Marius." Fine hastened to intervene. Haven't I told you to make haste?" she cried. What are you troubling yourself about?" She threw him his clothes, and added that she would wait in the passage. Marius stopped her. Excuse me," he said, I cannot leave my brother in ignorance of our misfortunes." And in spite of Fine's impatience, he related again the result of his journey to Marseilles. He, however, gave his brother no advice, but left him at full liberty to come to a decision himself. So then," exclaimed Philippe, completely crushed, "you've not given the money to the jailer, and we're without a copper?" Don't worry yourself about that," replied Robertega, drawing near. You can help me later on." The prisoner said nothing. He was no longer thinking of his escape. His thoughts were centred on his poverty, on the sorry figure he would henceforth cut, once he was at liberty. No more smart clothes, no more strolls in fashionable haunts, no more love adventures. But besides all this he had some chivalrous feelings, some poetical ideas which forbade him accepting Robertega's sacrifice. He lay back on his miserable bed, drew the clothes up to his chin, and said quietly, Very well, I shall stay where I am." Marius's face beamed. Fine looked overwhelmed. She tried to prove the necessity for the escape, she spoke of the public exhibition, of the infamy of the pillory. She grew excited and looked superb in her passion, and Philippe gazed at her admiringly. My beautiful child," he replied, you might succeed in making me yield if I had not grown blind and obstinate in this cell. But really I have done enough mean things already without wishing to burden my conscience with any more. We are in the hands of Providence. Moreover, all is not yet lost. Marius will free me. He'll find the money somehow. You see if he don't. You shall come and fetch me when you've paid my ransom, and we'll fly together, and I'll give you a kiss." He spoke almost gaily. Marius took his hand. Thanks, brother," he said. Be of good cheer." Fine and Robertega went out, whilst Philippe and Marius remained alone a few minutes. They had some serious and affecting conversation. They spoke of Blanche and the child she was expecting. When the visitors were back in the jailer's room, the flower girl, in despair, asked Marius what he thought of doing. I shall make some further efforts," he replied. Unfortunately, we have not much time, and I scarcely know where to seek assistance." I can give you a piece of advice," observed Robertega. There's a banker in this town, living close by here, named Rostand, who would perhaps consent to lend you a considerable sum. But I must warn you that this Rostand has the reputation of being an usurer." Marius had not the choice of means. Thanks," he said. I will call on the man to-morrow." CHAPTER XVI. The Usurers. Monsieur Rostand was a clever man. He pursued his shameful calling undisturbed. To give an honest appearance to his trade, he had opened a banking house; and, having paid for the license, he was legally established. At times he could even be a trifle honest, and would lend money at the same rate of interest as the other bankers of the town. But there was, so to say, a back office in his establishment, wherein he took delight in elaborating his knavish schemes. 6 months after the opening of his bank, he became the managing director of a company of usurers, a black band which entrusted him with certain funds for investment. The combination was of a simplicity quite patriarchal. People endowed him with the bump of usury, and, who feared to indulge their propensity at their own risk and peril, brought him their money and requested him to turn it to good account. By these means he always had a considerable capital to turn over, and was enabled to take full advantage of needy borrowers. Those who furnished the money remained in the background. He had solemnly undertaken to lend at a fabulous rate of interest, at 50, 60, and even 80%. The sleeping partners met at his office once a month, he produced his accounts, and they shared the spoil.
but he so arranged matters as to keep the larger share for himself. In fact, he robbed the robbers. It was especially against the small traders that he directed his operations. When a shopkeeper came to see him the day before a payment fell due, he imposed most exorbitant terms. The tradesman invariably accepted them, and in this way he had brought about more than 50 failures in 10 years. Moreover, all was fish that came to his net. He would as soon lend 5 francs to a market woman as 1,000 to a cattle dealer. He kept a sharp lookout and never lost an opportunity of investing 10 francs one day to receive 12 the next. He was on the watch for noble youths, fast young men who fling their money out of window. He filled their hands with gold so that they might throw the more, and he stood outside to pick up what they threw. He also took trips into the country and tempted the peasants. When the crops failed, he dispossessed them piece by piece of their land and farms. His house had thus become a veritable pitfall which swallowed up whole fortunes. The individuals, the entire families he had ruined were well known. No one was ignorant of his underhand dealings. His sleeping partners were pointed at in the streets, wealthy men, ex-officials, merchants, and even workmen. But proof was lacking. His banker's license shielded him, and he was too clever to allow himself to be caught napping. Since he had first started his nefarious speculations, Rostand had only once found himself in danger. The affair created a great sensation. A lady belonging to a wealthy family borrowed a rather large sum of him. She was very pious, and had bereft herself of her fortune by giving money and charity on all sides. Knowing that she was completely without means, he insisted upon her signing bills with her brother's name. Having these forgeries in his possession, he was certain of being paid by the brother, who would be anxious to avoid a scandal. The poor lady signed as required. Charity had ruined her, and the weak kindliness of her nature brought about her fall. His calculations turned out correct, and the first bills were paid. But as more and more were presented, the brother grew tired of paying, and determined to get to the bottom of the matter. He called on Rostand, and threatened to expose him. He said that he would sooner see his sister disgraced than allow himself to be further robbed with impunity by such a scoundrel. The usurer, thoroughly cowed, gave up the bills he still possessed. He did not, however, lose a copper on the transaction, having advanced the loan at cent per cent. Since then, Rostand had been extremely careful. He invested the capital of the Black Band with a skill which won him the admiration and confidence of the usurers. Whilst his sleeping partners were airing themselves in the sunshine, like worthy people who would never rob a soul, he remained buried in a great dark office. It was there that the golden coins of the concern grew and multiplied. Rostand had ended by acquiring quite an affection for his fraudulent and thievish trade. Some members of the band applied their profits to satisfying their passions, their appetites for luxurious and dissolute living. He took his sole delight in being a clever rascal. He felt as much interest in each of his operations as if it had been a drama or a comedy he was witnessing. He applauded himself when his plans succeeded, and then felt the pride, the joy of a successful author. Then he spread out on a table the money he had stolen, and lost himself in all the voluptuous sensations of the miser. It was to such a man that Revertéga had naively sent Marius. The latter knocked at Rostand's door on the following morning towards 8 o'clock. It was a heavy square house, and the closed shutters gave it a bare, cold appearance, an air of mystery and mistrust. A toothless old waiting woman, attired in a dirty, ragged cotton gown, opened a door a few inches. "Monsieur Rostand?" asked Marius. "He is in, but engaged," replied the servant, without opening the door any wider. The young man, losing patience, pushed the door open and entered the hall. "Very well," he said, "I'll wait." Surprised, and scarcely knowing what to do, the servant, seeing she could not get rid of him, took him up to the first floor, and left him by himself in a kind of anteroom. It was a small dark apartment, hung with greenish wallpaper, discolored by large damp stains. The only furniture consisted in a rush-bottomed chair, upon which Marius seated himself. Opposite him, an open door showed the interior of an office in which a clerk was writing with a quill pen, which made a grating noise as it travelled over the paper. There was another door on his left, which probably led to the banker's private room. Marius waited a long time. The stale smell of old papers pervaded the atmosphere around him. The apartment was sickeningly dirty, and the nakedness of the walls gave it a lugubrious appearance. Dust was accumulated in all the corners, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. The young man was suffocating, and getting out of patience with the grating of the quill pen which kept on increasing. Suddenly he heard voices in the adjoining room, and, as the words reached him clear and distinct, he was on the point of discreetly moving further off, when certain expressions rooted him to the spot. There are some conversations which it is permissible to overhear, scrupulousness not being intended as a safeguard of the privacy of certain people. A harsh voice, no doubt that of the master of the house, was saying with friendly bluntness, "Gentlemen, we are all here, let's talk business. The sitting is open. I will render you a faithful account of my operations of the month, and we will then proceed to the division of the profits." There was slight noise, a sound of private conversations dying away. Marius, who so far had not understood, felt nevertheless a lively curiosity. He guessed that some strange scene was taking place on the other side of the door. As a matter of fact, the usurer Rostand was closeted with his worthy associates of the Black Band. The young man had called just at the time of their meeting, when the managing director was about to produce his accounts, explain his operations, and divide the spoil. The harsh voice continued. "Before entering into details, I must inform you that this month's results are not so good as last month's. We then had an average of 60%. Today we have only 55. Various exclamations arose, similar to the protesting murmurs of a dissatisfied crowd. There must have been about 15 persons in the room. "Gentlemen," continued Rostand with bitter raillery, "I have done what I could, and you ought to thank me. The business becomes more difficult every day. However, here are my accounts, and I will give you a rapid statement of some of the affairs I have transacted." Complete silence ensued for a few seconds. Then there was a rustling of paper and the sound of the leaves of a ledger being turned over. Marius, beginning to understand, listened more attentively than ever. Rostand commenced to go over his various operations, giving some explanations as to each one. He spoke in the sing-song voice of a court official. "I lent," he said, 10,000 francs to young Count de Salvi, a youth of 20, who will attain his majority in 9 months' time. He had lost at play, and his mistress, it seems, required a large amount from him. He signed bills at 3 months for 18,000 francs. These bills are post-dated the day of his majority, so as to make all secure. The family owns large estates. It's an excellent affair." A flattering murmur greeted the usurer's words. "On the morrow," he continued, "I received a visit from the Count's mistress, who was exasperated, her lover only having given her 2,000 or 3,000 franc notes. She swore that she would bring me the Count bound hand and foot to negotiate a fresh loan. I shall then require the assignment of one of his estates. We have still 9 months to shear the young fool, whom his mother leaves without money." Rostand turned over some leaves of the ledger, and resumed after a short silence. "Jourdier, a cloth merchant, who each month requires a few 100 francs to meet his bills. At the present time his business belongs almost entirely to us. I last lent him 500 francs at 60%. If he asks for anything next month, I'll make him bankrupt, and we shall take the whole of his stock. Marianne, a market woman, every morning she wants 10 francs, and every evening she returns me 15. I fancy she drinks. It's a small affair, but a certain profit, a fixed income of 5 francs a day. Laurent, a peasant of the Roquefavre district. He has made over to me, piece by piece, some land he owned near Arques. The ground is worth 5,000 francs, and has only cost us 2,000. I had the man evicted from the place, and his wife and children came here and made quite a scene. You'll take it into account, I hope, these annoyances I have to put up with. André, a miller. He owed us 800 francs, and I threatened him with an execution. He hurried here and implored me not to ruin him by letting every one know of his insolvency. I consented to effect the seizure myself without employing a bailiff, and by that means I obtained over 1,200 francs worth of furniture and linen. I made quite 400 francs by being good-natured." A tremor of satisfaction passed through his colleagues. Marius could hear the smothered laughter of those men who were rejoicing at Rostand's cleverness. The latter continued. "Now for the simple cases. 3,000 francs at 40% to the merchant Simon.
1,500 francs at 50% to Charançon, the cattle dealer. 2,000 francs at 80% to the Marquis de Cantarelle. 100 francs at 35% to the son of Tingray, the notary.
And Rostand went on thus for a quarter of an hour, reading out names and figures, mentioning loans varying from 10 francs to 10,000, and interest from 20 to 100%.
" But what were you telling us, my dear friend? " asked a thick, husky voice when he had finished. " You have worked wonderfully well this last month. All these assets are excellent. It is impossible for the profit not to average more than 55%. You no doubt made a mistake when you mentioned that figure." " I never make a mistake," the usurer curtly answered.
Marius, who had almost placed his ear against the door, thought he noticed some hesitation in the wretch's voice.
" I have not yet told you everything," Rostand continued, with embarrassment. " We lost 12,000 francs a week ago."
These words created quite an uproar, and Marius hoped, for a moment, that these scoundrels would set upon one another.
" Hang it all, listen to me," cried the banker, amid the tumult. " I help you to make enough money for you to excuse me if you lose some once in a way. Besides, it wasn't my fault. I was robbed."
He uttered these words with all the indignation of an honest man. When quiet was restored, he added:
"Here's the whole story. Monnier, a corn dealer and a solvent man, about whom I had obtained reliable information, came to borrow 12,000 francs. I said I could not lend them myself, but that I knew an old skinflint who would perhaps advance the money at exorbitant interest. He called again the next day and told me that he was ready to agree to any conditions. I told him that 5,000 francs interest for 6 months was required. He agreed. You see, it was as good as a gold mine. Whilst I went to fetch the cash, he sat down at my table and wrote out 17 bills of 1,000 francs each. I examined them and placed them on the corner of this desk. Then I conversed a few minutes with Monnier, who got up, and after putting his money away, prepared to leave. When he was gone, I took the documents to put them in a place of safety. But just fancy, the rogue had changed the bills for a similar bundle of worthless ones, scribbled all over, payable to the deuce knows who, and unsigned. I was robbed, and nearly had a fit. I ran after the swindler, whom I found strolling along the Cour in the sunshine. At the first word I uttered, he called me a usurer, and threatened me with the police commissary. That Monnier has the reputation of being a loyal and upright man, and so, upon reflection, I preferred to hold my tongue."
This story had been several times interrupted by the angry remarks of the listeners.
" You must admit, Rostand, that you have been wanting in energy," observed the husky voice. " Well, we've lost our money, and will only get 55%. Another time you must look after our interests better. Now we'll divide the profits."
In spite of his anguish and indignation, Marius could not help smiling. Monnier's robbery was like a grand piece of comedy, and in his heart he applauded the knave who had cheated a knave. He now knew the trade Rostand followed. He had not lost a word of what had been said in the adjoining room, and he easily pictured to himself the scene that had been passing there. Leaning back on his chair, his ear close to the door, he could see in his mind's eye the usurers quarrelling among themselves with eager looks and faces contracted by the evil passions which were agitating them. He felt a kind of bitter mirth when he thought of his reason for coming to that thieves' den. What simplicity, good heavens! It was there he had thought to obtain the 15,000 francs which were to save Philippe, and he had not been waiting an hour for the banker to turn him out like a beggar. Or else Rostand would demand 50% interest and rob him impudently. At that thought, and with the knowledge that there was there, close to him, a meeting of rascals who throve on the shame and misfortunes of a town, he jumped up and laid his hand on the door handle. One could hear the clink of gold within the room. The usurers were dividing their spoil. Each one was pocketing his share of a month's swindling. That money which they were counting, and whose music voluptuously titillated their flesh, seemed at times to sob aloud amidst the quivering silence, broken only by the banker's voice uttering figures with metallic harshness. He calculated each one's share, named an amount, and let fall a pile of jingling coins. Marius turned the handle, and, with pale face and resolute gaze, stood a few seconds silent in the doorway. The young man had a strange spectacle before him. Rostand was standing at his table. Behind him was an open safe from which he took handfuls of gold. Around the table were seated the members of the Black Band, some awaiting their share, others pocketing the money they had just received. Every minute the banker consulted his accounts, examining a ledger, and doled out the money with a careful hand. His confederates were watching his movements. At the sound of the opening door, all the heads turned quickly round with fright. And when they beheld Marius, grave and indignant, they instinctively closed their fingers on their heaps of gold. For a moment all was confusion and apprehension. The young man recognized the wretches perfectly. He had met them in the streets with heads erect and dignified mien, and he had even bowed to some who might have saved his brother. They were all wealthy, esteemed, and influential. There were among them ex-government officials, landed proprietors, and persons who frequented the churches and drawing-rooms of the town. To see them thus, cringing and paling beneath his gaze, he could not restrain a movement of disgust. Rostand rushed forward, his eyes blinking feverishly, his thick discoloured lips trembling, all his miser's red and wrinkled face expressing a sort of sacred surprise. "What do you want?" he asked Marius, stammering. "You have no right to walk into a house in this manner." "I wanted 15,000 francs," replied the young man, in a cold and scoffing tone of voice. "I've no money," the usurer hastened to say, retreating to the door of his safe. "Oh, be easy, I no longer wish to be robbed. I must tell you that I've been waiting an hour on the other side of the door, and have heard all you've been saying." This statement came like the blow of a club, and caused the members of the black band to bow their heads. These men had still some slight feeling of respectability left, and there were some who hid their faces in their hands. Rostand, having no reputation to lose, gradually recovered himself. He again went up to Marius, and raised his voice. "Who are you?" he cried. "By what right do you come into my house listening at doors? Why do you come into my private office, if you have nothing to ask of me?" "Who am I?" said the young man, in a calm, quiet tone. "I am an honest man, and you are a rascal. By what right did I listen at this door? By the right that respectable people have of unmasking scoundrels. Why have I come in here? Simply to tell you that you are a villain." Rostand was trembling with rage. He could not account for the presence of this avenger who thus told him the truth to his face. He was about to shout out, to fall upon Marius, when the latter energetically motioned him back. "Keep quiet," he resumed. "I am going, I am stifling here, but I would not go without relieving my feelings a bit. Ah, gentlemen, you have a voracious appetite. You gluttonously share among you the tears and despair of entire families. You gorge yourselves with robbery and swindling. I am glad to be able to trouble your digestion a trifle, and to make you shiver with anxiety." Rostand attempted to stop him, but he continued in a louder tone of voice. "Highwaymen possess at least courage. They fight and risk their lives. But you, gentlemen, you rob shamelessly in secret. And to think that it was not necessary for you to become swindlers to live. You are every one of you well to do. You behave like scoundrels, Heaven forgive me, for pleasure." Some of the usurers rose menacingly. "You've never before seen the anger of an honest man, have you?" added Marius scoffingly. "Truth both annoys and frightens you. You're accustomed to be treated with the respect due to decent people, and as you have arranged to hide your baseness and to live esteemed by all, you have ended by yourselves believing in the respect accorded to your hypocrisy. Well, I've chosen that for once in your lives you should be insulted as you deserve, and that's why I entered here." The young man saw that they would fall upon him if he went on. He retreated step by step towards the door, keeping the usurer at bay by the firmness of his gaze. Once there, he stopped again. "I know very well, gentlemen," he said, "that I cannot bring you to the bar of human justice. Your wealth, your influence, and your skill render you inviolable. If I were foolish enough to fight against you, it is I, no doubt, who would be crushed. But anyhow I shall not have to reproach myself with having been in the company of such men as you without having shewn them my contempt. I would that my words were red-hot irons that would brand you on your faces. The crowd would follow you with its howls, and perhaps the lesson would do you good. Share your gold. If there's an atom of honesty left in you, it will burn your hands." Marius closed the door, and went off. When he reached the street, he smiled sadly.
He saw life spread out before him in all its shame and wretchedness, and perceived he was performing the noble and ridiculous part of a Don Quixote of justice and honour. End of chapters 15 and 16. Part 1, Chapters 17, 18, and 19 of the Mysteries of Marseilles by Émile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Two Shameless Characters. When Marius had related his adventure to the jailer and flower girl, the latter exclaimed, "We're no better off than we were. Why did you lose your temper? That man might have lent you the money." Women possess a certain obstinacy which renders the feminine conscience easier. Therefore fine, loyal girl though she was, would perhaps have closed her ears at Rostand's, or even have made use of the secrets chance placed in her possession. Revertéga felt rather ashamed at having advised Marius to go to the banker. "I warned you, sir," he said. "I was aware of the rumours afloat about the man, but I thought a great deal was said out of spite. Had I known the real truth I would never have sent you to him." Marius and Fine spent the afternoon in forming extravagant plans, in cudgelling their brains in vain for a means of obtaining the 15,000 francs necessary for Philippe's safety. "What!" exclaimed the young woman, "can't we find in all this town some kind soul willing to help us out of our trouble? Are there no rich people here who would lend their money at a reasonable rate? Come, uncle, think a bit. Tell me of some benevolent person whom I may go and plead to on my knees." Revertéga shook his head. "Well, yes," he replied, "there are worthy people here, rich folk who would perhaps assist you. But you have no claim on their bounty. You can't go and ask them for money right off. You must apply to money-lenders or bill discounters, and, as you've no solid security to offer, you're obliged to deal with usurers. Oh, I know some old misers, old rascals who'd be delighted to have you in their clutches, or else would chuck you out like dangerous beggars." As Fine listened to her uncle, all these money questions got rather mixed in her young head. She was so frank, so open-hearted, that it seemed to her quite natural and easy to ask for and obtain a large sum in a couple of hours. There are millionaires who can so easily dispose of a few thousand francs without inconveniencing themselves. She therefore persisted. "Come, think well," she said again to the jailer. "Do you really know of nobody we might apply to?" Revertéga, greatly affected, looked at her anxious face. He would rather not have laid bare the unsavoury realities of life before this young creature, full of the hopes of youth. "No, really," he replied, "I know of no one. I have spoken to you of old rascals who have shamelessly made large fortunes. They, like Rostand, lend 100 francs to receive 150 at the end of 3 months." He hesitated, and then went on in a lower tone of voice. "Shall I relate to you the history of one of these men? His name is Roumieux, and he's a retired notary. His game was to prosecute a terrible chase after inheritances. He would introduce himself into families, where his calling should have made him a confidant and friend, and there study the ground and prepare his ambuscades. Whenever he came across a weak-minded person who had property to leave, he became his creature, circumvented him, and drew him gradually into his meshes by obsequiousness and blandishments, by quite a clever comedy of little attentions and filial tenderness. Ah, he was a clever fellow. You should have seen him fascinate his prey, making himself supple and winning, gaining a hold on the affections of some old man. He ousted the natural heirs, the nephews and cousins, by degrees, and then drew up a new will which despoiled them of their relatives' fortune and appointed him sole legatee. But he never hurried matters, he would take 10 years to reach his goal, to mature things thoroughly. He advanced with feline craftiness, creeping along in the dark, never springing upon his prey until it lay panting, rendered inert by his gaze and caresses. He hunted inheritances like the tiger hunts game, with noiseless cruelty and a ferocity hidden behind smirks and smiles. Fine fancied she was being told a story out of the Arabian Nights. She listened to her uncle, her eyes wide open with astonishment. Marius was becoming familiar with base actions. "And you say this man made a large fortune?" he asked the jailer. "Yes," the latter replied. "There are some strange stories told which prove Roumieux's amazing cleverness. For instance, 10 or 15 years ago he worked his way into the good graces of an old lady who possessed a fortune of close upon 500,000 francs. It was quite a conquest. The old lady became his slave, almost to the point of refusing herself a crust of bread in order not to encroach upon the wealth she wished to leave to this demon, who possessed her like a devil and obtained complete mastery over her. She was indeed possessed in the true sense of the word. All the holy water of a church would not have been sufficient to cast him out. A visit from Roumieux would plunge her into endless ecstasy. When he bowed to her in the street, it was as though she had received a shock, she became quite red with joy. One has never been able to understand by what flattery, by what skilful and irresistible advance the notary had been able to penetrate so deeply into this heart which was closed by the most exaggerated piety. When the old lady died, she despoiled her direct heirs and left her 500,000 francs to Roumieux. Everybody expected this would happen. After a pause, Robertegas went on. Listen, I can give you another instance. The anecdote contains quite a cruel comedy, in which Roumieux gave proof of rare artfulness. A man named Richard, who had amassed several 100,000 francs in business, retired, and went to live with a worthy couple who nursed him and enlivened his old age. In exchange for their affectionate attentions, the retired merchant had promised to leave them his fortune. They lived on in this expectation. They had several children whom they hoped to establish well in life. But Roumieux happened to pass by, and soon became Richard's intimate friend. He would take him occasionally into the country, and secretly obtained complete mastery over him. The family which had received the retired merchant suspected nothing, they continued to nurse him and await the inheritance. During 15 years they lived thus, quite easy in their minds, forming plans for the future, and feeling certain of being happy and rich. Richard died, and on the morrow Roumieux was found to have inherited his property, to the great surprise and grief of this family, swindled both in its affections and its interest. Such is the hunter after inheritances. When he moves one cannot hear the sound of his claws upon the ground. His bounds are too rapid to be measured. He has already sucked his prey dry before he has been observed to be upon it. Fine felt filled with disgust. No, no, she said. I will never go and ask money of such a man. Don't you know another, uncle? All usurers are alike, my poor child, replied the jailer. They all have some indelible stain on their lives. I know an old skinflint who has more than 1 million, and who lives alone in a dirty, tumble-down house. Guillaume buries himself out of sight in his foul den. The damp is rotting the walls, the floor is not even paved, but is a sort of muck-heap consisting of mud and filth. Cobwebs hang from the ceiling, the dust lies thick over everything, while a dull, lugubrious light penetrates through the window-panes which are coated thick with dirt. The old miser seems to sleep amidst impurities, like the waiting spider sleeps in the centre of his web on the beam. When some prey becomes entangled in the nets he has spread, he draws it to him and sucks it dry of its life-blood. His food consists solely of vegetables cooked in plain water, and he never satisfies his hunger. He clothes himself in rags and leads the life of a leprous beggar. And all this for the sake of keeping the money he has already accumulated, and of adding unceasingly to his store. He only lends at cent per cent. Fine turned pale at the picture her uncle was setting before her. Guillaume has friends, however, who extol his piety, continued the jailer. He believes in neither heaven nor hell, and would sell the Saviour a second time if he had the opportunity, but he has been clever enough to sham great devoutness, and this piece of acting has won him the esteem of certain narrow minds. He may be met dragging himself about the churches, kneeling behind every pillar, using gallons of holy water. Inquire throughout the town, ask anyone what good action this saintly person has ever done. He worships the Almighty, it is said, but he robs his fellow man. It's impossible to name a single creature he has ever assisted. He lends at an usurious rate, he has never given a copper in charity. Were some poor wretch to be dying at his door, he wouldn't take him a crust of bread nor a glass of water. If he enjoys any kind of esteem, it's because he has stolen it, the same as everything else he possesses. Robertegas stopped and looked at his niece, scarcely knowing whether he should continue. And you would be simple enough to apply to such a man, said he at last. I cannot tell you everything. I cannot speak of his vices, for the old scoundrel has ignoble ones. At times he forgets his avarice to satisfy his lust. There are shocking stories told of him." "Enough!" cried Marius energetically. Fine, confused and dismayed, bowed her head, having lost all courage and hope. "I see money is too dear," the young man resumed, "and that one must sell oneself to obtain it. Ah, if I had only the time to earn the sum we require by hard work!" Then all three remained silent, unable to find a means of salvation. CHAPTER XVIII. IN WHICH THERE IS A GLIMMER OF HOPE. The following morning Marius, urged on by necessity, decided on calling on Monsieur de Girousse. He had been thinking of applying to the old Count ever since he had been in search of money, but had always refrained from doing so on account of the nobleman's original bluntness. He felt ashamed to own his poverty, and blushed at the thought of having to confess to what use he proposed putting the amount he was asking for. Nothing seemed more painful to him than to be compelled to take any third party into his confidence in regard to his brother's escape, and Monsieur de Girousse frightened him more than anyone else. When the young man called, the mansion was closed, the Count having just left for Lambesc. His errand was so disagreeable to him that he was almost glad at finding no one at home. He remained on the Cours, irresolute, not daring to go to Lambesc, and in despair at being reduced to inaction. As he advanced along one of the paths, quite upset, and with his eyes wandering vaguely about him, he met Fine. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. The flower girl, with her best clothes on, had a small travelling bag in her hand, and appeared all smiles and determination. "Where are you off to?" he inquired with surprise. "I am going to Marseilles," she answered. He looked at her curiously, asking for an explanation with his eyes. "I can tell you nothing," she continued. "I have a plan, but am afraid of failure. I shall return to-night. Come, never despair." Marius accompanied Fine to the diligence. When the heavy vehicle set out, he followed it for a long time with his eyes. This carriage bore away his last hope, and would bring him back joy or anguish. Up to the evening he watched all the diligences coming in, until at length there remained only one to arrive, and Fine had not yet returned. The young man, devoured by impatience, walked nervously backward and forward, trembling lest the flower girl should not return until the following day. In his trouble as to what this last attempt might be, he felt he had not the courage to pass another whole night of uncertainty and anxiety. He walked about the Cours, shivering, and a prey to a sort of nightmare. At last he perceived the diligence in the distance, in the centre of the Rotonde Square. When he heard the wheels rumbling on the stones, his heart beat violently. He set his back against a tree, and watched the travellers stepping out one by one. All at once he felt as if rooted to the spot. He had seen the tall form and sad, pale face of Abbe Chastanier appear at one of the open doors of the vehicle, almost opposite him. When the Abbe was on the pavement, he extended his hand, and helped out a young lady who was none other than Mademoiselle Blanche De Cazalis. Fine lightly sprang to the ground behind her, without making use of the step. She was beaming with smiles. The two travellers, guided by Fine, went off in the direction of the Hôtel des Princes. Marius, who had remained in the shades of early evening, followed them in a mechanical manner, at a loss to understand, as if stultified. Fine remained 10 minutes in the hotel at most. As she left she caught sight of the young man, and ran towards him in a fit of delight. "I succeeded in bringing them here," she exclaimed, clapping her hands, "and now I trust they will obtain what I want. To-morrow we shall be fixed." Then she took Marius's arm, and gave him an account of her journey. The previous evening she had been struck by something the young man had said about regretting he had not the time before him to earn the amount he required by work. On the other hand, the anecdotes her uncle had related had shown her that it would be impossible to find a moneylender or usurer disposed to be reasonable. The matter was therefore reduced to one of gaining time, of delaying as long as possible the moment when Philippe would be attached to the pillory. What terrified them was this public exhibition, and the infamy it carried with it, by handing over the condemned to the sneers and insults of the mob. From that moment the young girl's plan was formed. It was a bold plan, which would perhaps succeed by reason of its audacity. Her intention had been to go straight to Monsieur Cazalis's, to penetrate as far as his niece and describe the picture of the public exhibition of Philippe, pointing out how insulting such a sight would be for her. She would persuade her to lend assistance, and both would go and implore the deputy to intercede. If Monsieur de Cazalis would not consent to ask for pardon, he would perhaps try to obtain a postponement. Fine, however, did not reason out her plans. It seemed to her impossible that Blanche's uncle could resist her tears. She had faith in her devotedness. The poor child was dreaming with her eyes wide open and hoping that Monsieur de Cazalis would relent at the last moment. This proud and obstinate man had meant to cover Philippe with infamy, and he would have allowed no obstacle to be placed in the way of his vengeance. Had she found herself in his path, she would have been crushed, she would have expended her brightest smiles and most touching tears in pure loss. Fortunately for her, she was assisted by circumstances. When she called at the deputy's mansion in the Cour Bonaparte, she was informed that Monsieur de Cazalis had just left for Paris on business connected with his political position. She then asked to see Mademoiselle Blanche, and was told, in a sort of vague manner, that the young lady was absent, that she was travelling. The flower girl felt very much embarrassed, but she was obliged to withdraw and to go back and think matters over in the street. All her plans were upset. This absence of the uncle and niece deprived her of the support on which she had relied, and she had not a single friend to whom she could appeal. She was determined, however, that she would not lose her last hope and return to X as sick at heart as on the previous evening, after having made a useless journey. All at once she thought of Abbé Chastanier. Marius had often spoken to her of the old priest. She knew how good and devoted he was. Perhaps he might be able to give her some valuable information. She found him at the house of his sister, the old invalided workwoman, and, unbosoming herself to him, explained in a few words the reason of her journey to Marseilles. The priest listened to her with lively concern. "It is Heaven that has sent you here," he answered. "I think, under circumstances such as these, that I may violate the secret that has been entrusted to me. Mademoiselle Blanche is not travelling. Her uncle, wishing to hide her condition, and being unable to take her to Paris, has rented a cottage for her in the village of Saint Henri. She is living there with a companion. Monsieur de Cazalis, who has received me back into his good graces and begged me to visit her frequently, has given me considerable power over her. Shall I take you to this poor child, whom you will find very much altered and broken down?" Fine accepted joyfully. Blanche turned quite pale when she saw the flower girl, and began to shed warm tears. There was a large bluish circle round her eyes, the blood had fled from her lips, and her cheeks were like white wax. One saw that a terrible cry, the cry of truth, rose within her and made her stagger. When Fine, in a sweet voice, accompanied by tender caresses, had made her understand that she could perhaps save Philippe from supreme humiliation, she stood straight up and said in a broken voice, "I am ready. Dispose of me. I hear a child speaking to me unceasingly of its father. I would fain appease the anger of this poor little creature which is yet unborn." "Well," continued Fine warmly, "assist us in our work of deliverance. I am certain you will obtain at least a respite if you make the attempt." "But," observed Abbé Chastanier, "Mademoiselle Blanche cannot go to X alone. I must accompany her. I know that if Monsieur de Cazalis hears of this journey he will load me with bitter reproaches. I accept, however, the responsibility of what I am doing, in the belief that I am acting as an upright man." As soon as the flower girl had obtained this consent, she hardly allowed the old man and young girl sufficient time to get a few things together for the journey. She returned to Marseilles with them, pushed them into the diligence, and it was thus that she brought them triumphantly into X. The following day Blanche was to pay a visit to the president of the bench of judges who had passed sentence on Philippe. When Fine had concluded her story, Marius embraced her warmly on both cheeks, a proceeding that made a bloom of pink overspread the young girl's forehead. CHAPTER XIX. A respite. Fine called on Blanche and Abbé Chastanier the next morning. She wished to accompany them to the door of the president's residence, so as to learn the result of their application without a moment's delay. Marius, who understood that his presence would be painful to Mademoiselle de Cazalis, began strolling about the cour like a soul in trouble, and followed the priest and two young girls at a distance. When the supplicants had gone upstairs, the flower girl perceived the young man and sighed to him to come and join her. They both waited, agitated and anxious, without exchanging a word. The president received Blanche with great commiseration.
He understood that she had received the cruellest of blows in this unfortunate business. The poor child could not speak. At the first she began to sob, and all her supplicating being begged for pity infinitely better than her prayers could have done. It was Abbe Chastanier who had to explain their presence and present their petition. Sir, said he to the president, we come with joined hands. Mademoiselle de Cazalis is already broken down by the misfortunes that have overwhelmed her. She implores you for pity's sake to spare her fresh humiliation. What would you have me do? Inquired the president in an unsteady voice. We desire, if it be possible, that you will prevent a fresh scandal. Monsieur Philippe Cayol has been sentenced to be publicly exhibited, and he is to undergo this punishment within the next few days. But the infamy will not attain him alone. It will not be a case of one culprit being fastened to the pillory. There will be a poor suffering child who now implores your pity. You understand, do you not? The yells and insults of the mob will recoil on Mademoiselle de Cazalis. She will be dragged in the mud by the people, and her name will be passed from mouth to mouth around the abominable post, with sneers of hatred and foul expressions. The president seemed deeply affected. He preserved silence for a moment. Then, as if struck with a sudden idea, he inquired, But was it Monsieur de Cazalis who sent you here? Is he aware of the steps you are taking? No, replied the priest with frank dignity. Monsieur de Cazalis does not know we are here. Men have interests, passions that bear them along, and which sometimes prevent them forming a clear judgment as to their position. Perhaps we are acting contrary to the wish of Mademoiselle de Cazalis's uncle in coming to solicit you. But above the passions and interests of men are goodness and justice. And so I do not fear to place my sacred character in jeopardy by taking upon myself to ask you to be good and just. You are right, sir, said the president. I understand the motives that brought you here, and as you see I am deeply affected by your words. Unfortunately I cannot prevent the punishment. It is not within my power to modify a sentence of a court of assizes. Blanche joined her hands. Sir, she stammered, I know not what you can do for me, but I implore you to be merciful. Say to yourself that it is I whom you have sentenced, and endeavor to case my sufferings. The president took her hands and answered her with parental tenderness. My poor child, I understand everything. The part I have played in this affair has been a painful one. At this moment I am in despair at not being able to say to you, Fear nothing, I have the power to overthrow the pillory, and you shall not be attached to the post with the condemned man. Then, asked the dejected priest, the exhibition will take place shortly. You are not even allowed to delay this deplorable scene. The president had risen. The Minister of Justice, he said, can put it off at the request of the Crown Advocate. Will you have this exhibition take place at the end of December? I shall be glad to give you a proof of my compassion and goodwill. Yes, yes, exclaimed Blanche warmly. Delay the terrible moment as long as possible. I shall perhaps feel stronger. Abbe Chastanier, who knew what Marius's projects were, thought that in presence of the president's promise he ought to retire without insisting further. So he joined Blanche in accepting the offer made them. Very well, that is understood, said the president, accompanying them to the door. I shall make the request, and I feel sure it will be granted, that justice shall not take its course before the expiration of 4 months. Until then, rest in peace, mademoiselle. Hope heaven will perhaps send you some balm to your wounds. The 2 supplicants proceeded downstairs. As soon as Fine perceived them, she ran to meet them. Well, she inquired, panting for breath. As I told you, answered Abbe Chastanier, the president cannot prevent the execution of the sentence. The flower girl turned quite pale. But, the old priest hastened to add, he has promised to intercede and to have the date of the exhibition adjourned. You have 4 months before you to labor for the prisoner's welfare. Marius had approached the little group formed by the 2 young girls and the Abbé in spite of his desire to stand aloof. The silent, solitary street appeared quite white in the intense heat of the noonday sun. Grass had sprung up between the bright paving stones, and a dog, that was giving an airing to its lean spine in the narrow streak of shade which fell from the houses, was the only other living thing about.
When the young man heard the words that fell from Abbe Chastanier, he rushed forward and grasped his hands effusively. "Ah, my father," he exclaimed in a trembling voice, "you have brought me back hope and faith. Since yesterday I had been doubting Providence. How can I thank you, how can I prove to you my gratitude? Now I feel possessed of invincible courage, I am certain of saving my brother." Blanche, at the sight of Marius, had hung her head. A warm blush had suffused her cheeks. She stood there, confused and embarrassed, suffering horridly at the presence of this youth, who was aware of her perjury and whom her uncle and she had plunged into despair. When the young man's joy had somewhat subsided, he regretted he had approached. The despairing attitude of Mademoiselle de Cazalis aroused his pity. "My brother has been very guilty," he said to her at last. "Pardon him, as I pardon you." These few words were all he could find. He would have liked to have spoken to her of her child, to have questioned her as to the lot reserved to this poor little creature, to have claimed it in the name of Philippe. But he saw her so bowed down that he dared not torture her further. Fine doubtless understood what was passing within him. While he walked a few steps with Abbe Chastanier, she said rapidly to Blanche: "Remember that I offered you to be a mother to your child. Now I love you, for I see you have a good heart. Make a sign, and I'll hasten to your assistance. But apart from that, I shall be on the watch, for the little creature must not suffer from the folly of its parents." Blanche's only answer was to silently squeeze the flower girl's hand. Big tears were trickling down her cheeks. Mademoiselle de Cazalis and Abbe Chastanier returned at once to Marseille. Fine and Marius hastened to the jail. They told Robertet that they had 4 months to prepare the escape, and the jailer swore he would abide by his word, on whatever day and hour they might remind him of it. The 2 young people desired to see Philippe before leaving X, so as to let him know what had taken place and tell him to have hope. At 11 o'clock in the evening, Robertet conducted them again to the cell. Philippe, who was becoming accustomed to the prison regulations, did not seem particularly depressed. "Provided I am spared the disgrace of the public exhibition," he said to them, "I will consent to everything. I would rather break my head open against a wall than be fastened to the post of infamy." And the following day the diligence brought Marius and Fine back to Marseille. They were about to continue the struggle to which their hearts urged them, on a much larger scale than before. They were about to dive to the bottom of human misery, and behold the bare wounds of a great city abandoned to all the passions of modern industry. End of chapters 17, 18, and 19. End of part 1.